Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to start the ceremony, and I would like to invite our following dignitaries on the stage for the lamplighting ceremony. Dr. Anil Handu, Director, Lab Services, BLK Max Hospital. Please may I invite you, sir. Dr. Rama Manchanda, Director, Lab Services, KM Hospital, Pune. Thank you. Dr. Mamta Soni, Senior Consultant, HOD, Apollo Hospital, Chennai. Yeah, keep on clapping, it doesn't cost. Thank you. Welcome, Doctor. Dr. Sita Lakshmi Subramaniam, St. John's Hospital, Bangalore. Bengaluru. Warm welcome to you, Doctor. Dr. Swati Pai, Manipal Hospital, Bengaluru. Warm welcome, Doctor. Warm welcome to you. Dr. D.K. Mishra, Tata Hospital, Kolkata. Thank you. And finally, from Mindray India, Deputy Director, Mr. Sudeep Mukherjee. May I invite you on the stage. All together symbolically, please. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to stand up, please. Shama Madam, may I invite you. Please, please, please come. A great beginning for Cube Heal 2022 here in Mumbai, presented to you by Mindray India Limited and under the auspices of BLK. Big round of applause, come on, let's do that. Thank you very much. Doctors, respected doctors, thank you so much. Kindly sit down, ladies and gentlemen, as we begin the proceedings. But before that, let me tell you a little about our partner, BLK Max Super Speciality Hospital, in collaboration with Mindray India, is glad to welcome you to the 5th edition of Hematology Symposium entitled Cube Heal 2022. The theme of this hematology extravaganza is HEAL, H-E-A-L, Hybrid Hematology, Education, Assemble and Learning. The event is being conducted under the aegis of Academic Affairs, Research and Continuing Education wing of Dr. B. L. Kapoor Memorial Hospital, New Delhi, as an activity of professional development on science of cell analysis by hematology analyzers conducted by the Department of Hematology. The focus of Cube Heal 2022 is on looking at the plethora of information available on new cell counters in terms of numerical data, research data, trend analysis, graphical patterns, etc., and the overall clinical application. Ladies and gentlemen, and my dear doctors, it gives me immense pleasure to kindly welcome Dr. Anil Handu to please give us a welcome address. Give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
This is all right. Thank you very much. Welcome address. That's what my job is right now. And I sincerely welcome you all to this edition of Cube. It's interesting and heartening to actually see all of you here. We've been doing Cube previously for the last 2 years in a digital mode. Thanks to Mindray for supporting it even at that moment of time. And we are glad that we are here again today, all of us, in person, and hopefully in future we will not face such a challenge again. And we sincerely hope that this will be a great event, just like the way in the past. There's a 5th edition of Cube today. And I hope the way we have actually pushed ourselves and tried to create a scientific event which is going to give some good information to all of us. We also have a nice program lined up for the end of the day, and of course something coming up in the morning tomorrow, which I'm sure my other colleagues will be informing you about. And we look forward to having a great event and a great gathering amongst all of you, and great, kind of bonhomie amongst all of us. Thank you very much for making it here, and we hope we'll have a great time together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anil Handu. And now may I invite from Mindray India Limited, Mr. Sudeep Mukherjee, Deputy Director, to talk to us. Thank you.
Yeah, this is okay.
Good afternoon, doctors, all participants, and the entire healthcare industry. At the outset, on behalf of Mindray India, I take the honor to extend my sincere gratitude to all for your presence here today to bless this occasion. A very warm welcome to all of you. I take this opportunity to salute the entire medical fraternity for their perseverance, hard work, and the attitude towards saving the life of the people. Mindray has completed its 30 successful years of journey, and we are moving ahead with our slogan, together, stronger, and further. Mindray is now one of the global leader in the providing medical devices and solutions. We have our presence in over 190 countries with 300 plus more products. Mindray is always committed in providing advanced technologies and solutions, and then transfer them into innovation, and then making it accessible to the larger part of the world. Mindray started its Indian operations in 2007, and over the 15 years, we have excelled as a market leader and established our presence as medical devices manufactured and serve the healthcare industry. We are not only known as manufacturers and marketeers, we are also very well known in the industry in imparting knowledge for the fraternity through various seminars, CMEs, and scientific events. One of them is CUBE, that is cytomorphometry, Unveiling blood evaluation, which is a true academic, scientific event wherein omniscient pathologists from all over the nation and from the world, they participate to enlighten us with their knowledge. This is a blockbuster mega event for us in the hematology, which was started in 2018. And Mindray India feels proud to host this along with BLK Max Group every year. This is the 5th consecutive year that we are hosting this event, and I convey my sincere gratitude to BLK Max Group, and especially Dr. Anil Handu, under whose guidance and leadership this whole event is being organized. Thank you, Dr. Sir. During these 2 days mega event, various cases in hematology are going to be discussed to aid everybody in the utility of clinical and novel parameters with the profound knowledge of all the eminent speakers here. I sincerely urge everyone to hold back for these 2 days for this special scientific feast and gain as much as knowledge which will further help you in day-to-day practice. With these few words of mine, I take this honor to commence CUBE Heal 2022 and once again extend a very warm welcome to the delegates and guests present in this platform. Welcome all. Thank you so much. Over to
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sudeep Mukherjee, Deputy Director, Mindray India. Thank you, sir. We are now having something very special, and for that, I want to invite some special people, because we are having the unveiling and the launch. So may I invite Dr. Sudeep Roy on the stage, please, Dr. Ajay Shah, Dr. Shehnaz Kodaiji, Dr. Pradeep Suri, Dr. Shabnam Ruhi, Dr. P.G. Subramaniam, Dr. Anil Handu. May I invite all of you on the stage. And we also like to specially thank and recognize and invite Dr. Sukesh Nair, CMC, with his blessings on this event from Vellore. Give him a big round of applause, Dr. Sukesh Nair. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your blessings. We are so honored to have you here, sir. Please come. You'll have to stand behind that. All of you are here? Lights. Thank you. Anybody else? We have missed out. Nikhil? I had 7 names, so shall I call them again? And Dr. Sudeep Roy, are you here? No. Dr. Ajay Shah? Yes. Okay, thank you. Dr. Shehnaz Kodaiji? Dr. Pradeep? Thank you. Dr. Shabnam Ruhi? Thank you. Dr. P.G. Subramaniam? And, of course, Dr. Anil Handu is here. So, my dear friends, we are now going to launch something very special, and at the count of 4, I want all our doctors to do what I say. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's go, because this is going to be the launch of Cube Heal 2022. I want all of you to just lift one by one and give it to me. Come on, big round of applause. Where are you going? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wow. Come on, I want you to clap. All of you to clap. Wonderful. God bless all of you. God bless Mindray. God bless PLK Max for this great opening today at Cube Heal 2022. Come on, clap more and more. Wow. Super. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Big round of applause to our dignitaries. Thank you for your presence. You like that one? I can't hear you. Okay, thank you. And Dr. Handu, don't go away, because I want you here, because we're having another small launch of a wonderful machine as I count 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's go with the music and the lights. Yeah, you can just gently pull it out. And here we go. Beautiful, this new lovely machine. And who's going to tell us about this? VC 760 and VC 780. Is that the one? Yeah, Shama, come on. Bail me out.
And this is the new entrant in the hematology family of Mindray, the smallest and the cutest instrument, which will cater all the necessities in your hematology laboratory. So this is the first of its kind in the hematology world, that we have combined CBC, DIF, RedTech with ESR. So this is first of its kind instrument, and it's awesome. It also has some more specialities that my colleague Mr. Biju in the later hours, for 15 minutes, will go through, and we will have that worldwide. That video will go worldwide. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Handu.
Thank you, Shama. Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you, respected Dr. Handu, for your presence and launching it. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now going to start with our business sessions. And the first of our speakers is Dr. Sukesh Nair.
Sorry, you'll have to invite Dr. Rama Manchanda, who will be chairing these 4 sessions.
Okay, thank you. So I'll first have to invite Dr. Rama Manchanda, who will be chairing these sessions. Thank you. Pranab. Dr. Sukesh Nair is there. Dr. Sukesh Nair, if you can see us and hear us, give us a shout. You can.
Yes, I can.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I have with me on stage, please give her a big round of applause to Dr. Rama Manchanda. Thank you, Dr. Manchanda, for being part of this wonderful symposium on Cube Heal. Dr. Sukesh Nair, over to you.
Most respected Manchanda madam, and the audience, I would have loved to be there, but unfortunately I triple booked myself on this day. In one in Bangalore, one in Indore, and one in Mumbai. And Bangalore people were very happy to accommodate me the previous day, that's yesterday. But Indore people were totally unrelenting, so obviously I had to make this presentation online. So my job is basically to tell about the science that's developing in cell counter. Cell counters are hemocytometer, and their science is going into something like cytology. So therefore I would say not only hemocytology, but it's an objective way of measuring hemocytology, it's hemocytometrology. Science is defined as the observation, identification, description, experimental investigation, and theoretical explanation of natural phenomena. A hematology analyzer is primarily to count blood cells with some degree of differentiation based on mainly physical nature in natural form or distorted, and a few by chemical reactions like fluorescent dyes. We know our cells and more, probably a little more, because of Romanowski dyes. And in fact, hematology is defined by Romanowski dyes because neutrophils are called neutrophils, because eosinophils are called eosinophils because they stain by eosin dye, and basophils are called basophils because they stain by the basic dye, and provide explanation for the natural phenomena that is there. We presume that analyzers are also seeing the stimuli we are seeing, but maybe better, most likely better. The interest now is to predict how much it sees and is able to explain the natural phenomena. Many of these natural phenomena are well understood, and now the cell counters have to identify, observe it, test it, describe it, till it becomes a testable explanation of the natural phenomena. Impedance, the basic heart of the Coulter principle, and of course adopted by most of the cell counters, especially the 3-part, has got immense accuracy. There are particle counters which can measure up to 1 nanometer in size. No other machines can do that. Nothing so far is better, but morphology is not like what we see. So a testable explanation needs more explanation. So now when we come to 5-part platforms, we must realize that many of the cell counters process the cells as they are being analyzed. So obviously it has got a lysis, which can be of a different type of lysis, which can impact the white cells, which are going to be differentiated based on some of the characteristics. Some of the white cells are still maintained in near native state. Some lose cytoplasm to allow dyes to enter them. So, but you must realize all the analysis that happens, irrespective of processing, is happening within a very, very short time. We are talking about a few seconds, about 30 to 40 seconds. And the impact, how much of the impact of the distortion of morphology impacts on the morphology of the cell. Then finally, after all that processing, look at the signal destination rather than the light source. Don't look at the light source, look at the signal destination. That's a photomultiplier. And therefore, the analysis is to discriminate based on physical attributes of the cell. Now it's purely physical attributes. Size, yes, because they maintain the size, there is no loss of size. Can be possible on DXH, alinity, Umicin, and indirectly on ADVIA. Fluorescence on XN, BC, and alinity. Staining and light loss on ADVIA and Umicin. Nucleocytoplasmic content because of the the high radio frequency current is DXH. but granularity in all the cell counters, directly or indirectly. Now, DXH, of course, we know that along the x-axis you have got scatter, that is the granularity. Along the y-axis you have got the size, and along the z-axis you have got the nucleocytoplasmic content. XN and BC, along the x-axis is scatter, along the y-axis is fluorescence based on the nuclear staining of the dye, the fluorescent dye. And of course, you have the basolysis where the cells are exposed to very low pH lye solution, where only basophils which have got probably the pH of 1 because it contains heparin survives the lysis, and they get counted because of the size which is along the y-axis, and that is the size. Then you have Umicin and Advia, which looks at staining of cells. They use a stain which basically stains the myeloperoxidase. Of course, straight away myeloperoxidase by Advia, and similar like myeloperoxidase on Umicin. But along the x-axis is basically on the Umicin is on the light loss. The size, and along the y-axis is the light loss. While in Advia, along the x-axis is the absorbance. That means the more the absorbance, that means more peroxidase staining. You have the cells coming on the x-axis, and along the y-axis is purely light loss. They also use the basolysis to differentiate basophils. Alinity, probably all the existing platforms have been building on the hardware which is same, and using the software they have been trying to develop new parameters. Alinity is, Abbott or Alinity is the only cell counter which has probably changed the hardware. It has changed a lot of photomultiplier tubes, and they brought in fluorescence in analysis of the white cells, and therefore they use size, scatter, and fluorescence to differentiate between the white cells. And of course, they did not want to sacrifice their MAPS technology. Now we know that we have suspect flags, but we also know that these cell counters analyzes the cells 360 degrees centigrade. Many systematic diseases bring changes in white cells, red cells, and platelets. Unfortunately, these changes are also reflected within the gating of the white cells, but there is no flag. So obviously, we'll have to look at how they can develop flags. Some of them can be used by cell population data, like for example, the VCS has been always having cell population data, but now more cell counters are giving cell population data. Only thing is you have to get a reference population and do your cell population data, and you'll know what is the average size of neutrophils in a population, what is the average size of lymphocyte, what is the average scatter of a neutrophil, what is an average conductivity of a neutrophil, what is the average fluorescence of a neutrophil. All that you can find out by using a reference population. And if you have a blood bank in your hospital, obviously you have healthy blood donors, you can use them. A new parameter has been, a lot of new parameters are being developed. Like for example, you have MDW, which is considered to be a person value which has got a highly negative predictive value for sepsis or acute bacterial infection of 98%, along with white cell count. So these are some of the new parameters coming from the cell population, which is from the scatter. Now, when you talk about sepsis, we always talk about toxic neutrophils. Obviously, toxic neutrophils, when you look under the microscope, has a lot of granules. So they thought that probably there may be more scatter in these neutrophils. And there was a study that was done by Fernando Chavez, who is now the medical director in Beckman Coulter. And he found the study in which he revealed that consistent finding in sepsis was that the neutrophils were large in volume, large in size. What they underplayed was the fact that actually the scatter was low. They actually thought the study will show more scatter, but actually the scatter was opposite. It was low. We must understand that they were confused why that happened. If you understand normal physiology, you will understand that from a myeloblast to a neutrophil takes 5 to 7 days, and the 4 changes happen to that. The blue color of the cytoplasm becomes gray because the RNA gets converted to proteins. The nucleus becomes smaller, then segmented. And then the granules start appearing promyelocyte, metamyelocyte. But by the time it comes to metamyelocyte, they lose their staining property because they mature, because the granules contain sialic acid. And as they mature, they lose the sialic acid and they stop taking up the basic dye, the azurophilic dye. So the granules are very much there. Only thing is they don't get stained. And of course, the size of the myeloblast becomes almost half. But when there is sepsis and when there is acute bacterial infection, this maturation of 5 to 7 days can happen in less than 1 day. That means the nucleus will go all through the segmentation. The granules do not lose their staining property, so they start appearing more. They start appearing to be more because they take up the staining dye, the Romanowski dye. So it's purely a normal. What we talk as toxic granules is nothing but the same granules, but they don't lose their staining property. It's a Romanowski phenomenon. The blue color completely does not disappear, and they remain as Dolly bodies. And the size of the neutrophil does not. I mean, the size of the neutrophil does not become as small as normal. It becomes large. So, large neutrophil, toxic granulation, Dolly bodies, they are all indicative of a neutrophil that is produced within less than 1 day of maturation, which basically means it's a acute bacterial infection. The study that we did in Vellore, which was done in about 12 years back, but published in 2016, we also brought in the fact that not only the neutrophil volume is high, the neutrophil scatter is low, we also found that the monocyte volume was also on the higher side compared to ICU controls. You know, the patients who are admitted with hanging or poisoning. It was purely on the monocyte volume also was much higher compared to them as well as blood donors. Now, if you look at this cell counter plot, you can realize that when the neutrophil becomes large and their scatter is low, they slowly start merging with the monocyte. And therefore, the monocyte distribution will be wider, either because of monocytes being there or some of the neutrophils being counted as monocyte. So this is called a pseudomonocytosis. So pseudomonocytosis of a cell counter is one of the earliest indication of sepsis. How do you identify that pseudomonocytosis? If you look at the histogram, after the lymphocyte, there's hardly any monocyte. What you see there as a peak is actually the left shift of the neutrophils. So if you have a histogram, you can easily identify the scatter plot or the monocytosis as pseudomonocytosis. So MDW is nothing but pseudomonocytosis. Of course, we realize that monocyte also contributes, in addition to neutrophils, into the cell counter data for identification of sepsis. It is potentially possible in all cell counters because when the sepsis happens, as you look at the lower spot, the neutrophils will have larger in size, will have lower scatter, and they will slowly start merging into the monocyte population, and monocytes will be exaggerated. Even in alinity, you can see that the monocyte and the neutrophil populations are merging, and therefore you can have potentially of pseudomonocytosis here. So how do you identify the monocyte count is true or pseudo? If you just look at the WBC histogram, you can see that if there is true monocytosis, you can see a peak at the WBC histogram. Both the histograms below, you can see that. Now, the previous case I showed you, you can see that if there is pseudomonocytosis, there will be no peak and the monocyte. That basically means the monocytes are being falsely counted because they are counting neutrophils as monocytes, and therefore pseudomonocytosis is a very important part of sepsis. So you must realize that cell counters will only tell you what it can analyze. In fact, we have Dr. Swati Pai there. She's the king of pseudo because she called eosinophilia as malaria, pseudobesophilia as dengue. If she had identified pseudomonocytosis, probably she would have identified pseudomonocytosis for sepsis much earlier if she had probably collected data on that. Now you must realize that other cell counters where cells are not important, size is not important. If you look at the fluorescence data on the on eosinophils and probably on Sysmex as well as on Mindray, the neutrophil fluorescence is very high during sepsis. But in the whole thing, you must realize that there is a very important and simple parameter called eosinophils. Eosinopenia is probably the earliest indicator of sepsis more than any changes that happen on the neutrophils. And you can see in the study that we did here, the eosinophil population in patients with sepsis was 0.1 compared to the people who had non-sepsis 0.6. Now you must realize that whenever we take the reference range for eosinophils, we always talk about 44 to 440, which is the reference you can see in Daisy, in Hofbrand, and all those things. They are all they don't belong to us. We should have our own reference range. The reference range that we developed was 0.2 to 0.6. Please understand the difference. The eosinophil reference range is different from different population. We can't use 44 to 440 at all, because which is 0.4 to 0.44. If I had used that reference range, I would have probably missed, 0.04. I would have missed diagnosing sepsis using eosinophil count. You have to use your own reference range. Similarly, for monocyte, everybody talks about monocytes. All cell counters exaggerate monocyte count. We have tuberculosis in our population. Even people who don't have symptoms, they have tuberculosis in the population. Please don't underestimate your, so please use your own reference range. If you do use the reference range that is available from outside, from DESI or whatever country, you will lose a lot of patients or a diagnosis on a lot of patients. So please don't say that this cell counter gives higher monocyte count. It is absolutely wrong. Of course, the high neutrophil fluorescence because of Dolly bodies. I'll give you an example how I use this data. 70-year-old retired, highly reputed professor of CMC undergoes a resection of colon because he had a severe colon with anastomosis. He spikes fever on day 4, CRP is high, and the surgeons think it's anastomotic leak. Yes, usually happens on day 4 or day 5 of surgery, post surgery. Now, if obviously the response is they have to take him for re-exploration, morbidity is on the higher side, and if you don't take him for re-exploration, and if it's an anastomotic leak, mortality is going to be high. So when they decide to take re-exploration, the surgical ICU consultant asked me, can you probably look at the blood film and say whether it is, because obviously an anastomotic leak will be bacterial type of infection. Can you say that this is bacterial or non-bacterial? His white cell count was higher from day 1 itself. So this is his scatter from XN. Here I can find that neutrophils looks absolutely calm. The count is high, neutrophil count is high, but they look absolutely calm. They are not having any higher fluorescence. But when I look at the lymphocyte, I can find there are few reactive lymphocytes. Now, before I give an opinion, I know that we have this reactive lymphocyte which can be quantitated by some of the cell counters by high fluorescent lymphocyte, high fluorescent cells, atypical lymphocytes, like that. So when I looked at the value, the HFLC was 1.6. Yes, there are reactive lymphocytes. But before giving the opinion, I thought I'll run the sample on another cell counter. And when I ran the sample, okay, fine. The neutrophils look very calm. There is some reactive lymphocytes which are merging with the monocyte population, which is quite good to know that there are reactive lymphocytes. And then what I find that, okay, now that they say the MDW is indicative of acute bacterial infection, I found that it's less than 23. So therefore, I am very confident there's no bacterial part at all. So I give the opinion that this is not bacterial at all. It probably could be viral. The registrar calls, the junior consultant calls, the senior consultant calls, and there's a retired surgeon from our place who came to help with the surgery because this guy was so senior. So when he called, I said it's not bacterial but viral, and his wife was my colleague. She retired many years back. So he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Only your wife probably taught me this." So he accepted my opinion. No re-exploration was done. This gentleman recovered and discharged on day 11 from SICU. Otherwise, they would have definitely taken him for re-exploration, where the morbidity would have been much higher. When we talk about iron deficiency anemia, we have been told that iron deficiency is microcytic hypochromic anemia with anisocytosis. Look at this picture on top. How many of you can say that these are microcytic red cells? If you say that this is microcytic red cell, next time when I give you the same blood film, you will call it as normosity. Size is subjective. But what is very objective in this is the color. Anisochromia is probably the most catching point of iron deficient erythropoiesis. And this, actually, I learned this from a cell counter because it's some cell counter which is called as hemoglobin distribution with percentage hypo, and therefore they give you anisochromia for a diagnosis of iron deficient erythropoiesis. CHR or the equivalent, that is RET-HE or RHE, is probably the lower CHR or lower RHG is an earliest indicator of iron deficient erythropoiesis. The earliest. Nothing can be, not iron deficient anemia, but iron deficient erythropoiesis. And when the patient starts on treatment, the response can be seen in shift in SCW. And all this I learned from a cell counter. Now, obviously, some cell counters measure the hemoglobin content of the red cell on the reticulocyte based on the my algorithm, based on very precise catching of low scatter light from the red cell. Some of them, of course, don't have that ability, so they actually use calculation to. So CHR is calculated. I mean, it's measured by ADVIA as well as by Alnity. While the equivalents are produced in RHE, RET-HE, in Sysmex and Mindray, and therefore they are calculated parameters. Mindray does have a equivalent of CHR, but I found that not at all reliable. But RHE of Mindray is much more reliable, and I'm very happy that there are some talks related to RHE and RET-HE because I found these parameters quite useful in my clinical practice. I'm very happy that there's only one talk related to IPF. So thanks that people have realized that IPF was probably not the right parameters because nobody talks about immature platelets because we never talk about mature platelets. So why we talk about immature platelets? So I'll tell you how I use calculated parameter in my clinical practice. One of my colleagues who was having chemo, also iron deficient, her hemoglobin dropped to 5.4. She's undergoing chemo. So she's on iron, her MCV is low. So when the husband said, we are coming to hospital to take you, can you organize 2 units of Paxil? I said, oh, no problem, I'll organize that. So I look for Paxils which have got good hemoglobin content. And because I had a hospital number, I took her peripheral smear and I found that the peripheral smear had hypochromic red cells. Yes, she is iron deficient with mild anisochromia. That means there are some red cells which are normal hemoglobin. And a few of the red cells were well hemoglobinized. But when I looked at the reticulocyte, the polychromatophilic red cells, they were really well hemoglobinized. That means the reticulocyte hemoglobin content was good. Obviously she is responding well to iron. So I thought I'll look at the RET-HE because when I look at the smear, I know that the CHR value is, reference range is 33 to 35. Now I'm not sure whether these well hemoglobinized red cells are 33 or 35. If I can confidently say that 35, that means there's a better chance. If I can confidently say that the 33, okay, come and have your transfusion. But I can't say that because morphology, when normality can be between 33 and 35, it has to be that. I can't say that. So therefore, I decided to look at the RET-HE, and the RET-HE was 42. It is not possible by any morphological event, even if it is calculated parameter. 42 was magical. I called them and I said, do you really want to come for transfusion? Can she, if she's is she really unwell? If she's just tired, just give her bed rest for 2 days. Anyway, we are going to repeat the hemoglobin 2 days later. Her bone marrow is doing a fantastic job. She's producing red cells where the red cells have got phenomenal hemoglobin. So, normally all these parameters, everybody uses RET-HE, RHE, CHR. When we are talking about iron deficiency, here we are talking about iron repletion. And I could tell them not to have transfusion. Why do you want some of the people who are close to you have blood transfusion? Blood transfusion is risky. So we avoided a blood transfusion in this lady. And, the next 2 days later, of course, I didn't sleep for the next 2 days. The 2 days later, hemoglobin was 8.4. They actually, the husband and wife still call me magician because I prevented 2 blood cell transfusions. So you must realize that cell counters do not hide anything. It is the individual who has the cell counter that gets masqueraded. And they get what you call unnecessarily involved by the pseudo, which actually indicates a possible diagnosis. A cell counter gives the output that represents complete analysis of the cells in the blood. Understanding of the disease process well, which is a pathology, we get to realize the same is clearly displayed and objectively measured by the cell counter. This understanding, if translated into patient care, can overcome many deceptive clinical scenarios. Of course, more studies by good centers will make this more impactful and times to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Suresh Nair, for your thoughts and for the information that you shared and the knowledge that you shared with us. We are indeed indebted and very grateful to you. Dr. Saab, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Now you'll be chairing?
She'll be chairing 4 sessions.
4 sessions. So now? Okay, I now invite Dr. Dhruv Mamtora, Head of the Department Laboratory and Infection Control, Bhai Wadia Hospital for Children, to kindly come and address us. And the topic is Journey Towards Laboratory Excellence, Experience Sharing from one of the largest public charitable organizations, Laboratory. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear doctors, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mamtora with a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Not to worry, I'm okay. So thank you so much for making me the chair for all the sessions. You'll have to bear with me. I invite Dr. Dhruv, who is currently the head of laboratory and specially in charge of the hospital control, infection control, quality, and accreditation. He is the coordinator in the Wadia Children's Hospital in Mumbai. We invite Dr. Dhruv Mamtora.
So good afternoon, everybody. I think my topic is about the laboratory excellence journey. So we are one of the largest public charitable hospital in the country, and we are almost a century-old organization. And this is about our journey of the laboratory excellence. How we last year we underwent the Malcolm Baldrige excellence framework, and we are the already award winner for that excellence. So that's how I come here on the stage to present our journey. So can I have the presentation loaded on?
Yeah,
the
they're
screen?
getting it, Doctor. Thank you.
So it's basically, Malcolm Baldrige is used in most of the industries for their excellence performance, and this is how we applied it to the laboratory services, which is one of the important part of the hospital, and how we are just trying to get along and implement the same for the laboratory.
Next slide, previous slide. I think this
Okay. Yeah, so here is our organization, which is almost a century old, started in 1926. I think it's not working. It's going, yeah. So this is our hospital. This is about today's topic. So yes, so it was started in 1928, and if we tell the journey, like in 2002, we have merged both the hospitals, that is maternity as well as the pediatric hospital. And in 2010, we started the automation for the laboratory. In 2017, we started the renovation, and we relocated the pediatric hospital, and that's where we started the most advanced laboratory with full automation brought in the lab. Then during the pandemic, in very short duration of time of 2 months, we started our COVID lab, that is the PCR lab, which is now currently undergone the NABL re-accreditation. And again, like in 2021, we had phased out and started our phase 2 expansion of the laboratory. And now, at this year, we started our sequencing lab, that is the most advanced lab attached to our hospital. So as we all go through this Malcolm Baldrige framework, which works on the vision, mission, and values. So where we are heading towards is what is our ultimate vision. Mission is how we are going to achieve our vision. Then the core values, which are like the guiding principles, which will help us to reach where we are supposed to reach. So quality is one of our priority, and the patients are our most important priority, as well as excellence is integrated in our framework. And this is our policy, so we have to give the most accurate and reliable results, complying with the best quality standards at affordable rates. That is, quality with the affordability is our main basic principle, I think, which we are catering in since years. And then how we are going to achieve. So we made the strategic goals for that divided into two parts, short term and long term. Then obviously, when we are doing something on a public charitable hospital, which are ever since ages, there are going to be challenges. So our challenges were like the logistic issues because of the pandemic. Secondly, we are a heritage class 2B structure. So any modification or renovation is very difficult to do in the hospital. Then also, third important challenge was upgrading our information system to the latest available information systems which are available in the market. And then lastly, whatever challenges posed by the pandemic related to the material availability, manpower availability, and additionally, a lot of breakdowns which happened during the pandemic, and also ever-changing guidelines. So these were our challenges. So what strategies we adopted? So one was we kept on adding the scope of the services to match whatever the services which are offered by both the hospitals. Then we are using directory of services as a guiding principle for teaching our doctors which are present in the hospital. Then implementation of the SOPs and ensuring that everybody complies to this SOPs. Then training and development, I think it is one of the most critical success factor which we have to focus, ensuring the best price for the quality of the supplies which we get and the equipment which we procure, and ensuring the minimal downtime for the equipment. So this is our organogram. These are our departments and the departmental assets. So this will define what all advanced equipments which we have and the future expansion plans of the departments. These are the scope of the services which we are offering. So currently around 200 tests are already NABL accredited, and we are slowly adding the scope to add this tests which are not under NABL scope. And these are our key processes, the process owners and the stakeholders for all the processes. And another process is academics, because we are an academic organization. So we have to support the ongoing research projects of the hospital, as well as to start new research in the department and mentor the apprentice from other government organizations. So what approach we deployed was, one is a quality assurance and quality control for the laboratory. That is our most important approach which we deployed. Second, training and development. So we follow the training in a very stringent way. And this is how we started our journey towards accreditation and the excellence since year 2018 and to this current stage of laboratory. These are the tools which we are using to capture the various data, like the quality indicators, then the incident reporting and reporting of the needle stick injury, then the kappa analysis and the NCs. We use the registers. And what are the results? So we have got, these are the results of the 2021. So you can see that as per the international guidelines, we are complying to most of the areas of the lab, except some of the areas where we have the manual work, like the microbiology and the histopathology. The training and development, we could train a lot of people, around 20-22 staff we are training each year for the laboratory. These are some of the training sessions which we have been conducting in the organizations. Then what are the results of the excellence? So if you see last 5 years performance, we have been adding a lot of new services. Additionally, we are able to, many of the areas we have already crossed our targets, and this is how we are able to achieve our results. So this is how this excellence framework works to bring out the results. in spite of being a pandemic for last 2 years, we are still able to maintain our performance and able to sustain the laboratory. What are the achievements? So one was NABL accreditation. I think for any public hospital to get NABL is like a big achievement. And we have almost started a lot of new tests in the phase 2 expansion. So we have already started doing the drug levels. We are already doing advanced hormonal testing. We have already started doing like genome sequencing and MLPA based tests. And even the molecular expansion we have already started, and phase 2 test we are going to begin in this next coming month. So this is how our achievements are. So I thank you for inviting me as a speaker. So this is our journey. Yeah. Okay.
She is the consultant pathologist from Dr. Kunal Sehgal's lab.
Very good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, I would like to thank Mindray and Dr. Kunal Sehgal to giving me this opportunity to perform on this platform. So, presentation. So, I'll be talking about the performance assessment of ESR and immature platelet fraction for Mindray BC 720 series analyzer. So before I start, few disclaimers. This study was co-designed by Mindray and Sehgal Path Lab and was funded and supported by Mindray. The aims of the study are performance assessment of ESR and IPF on Mindray BC 720 series, comparison of ESR on Mindray BC 720 with Westergren method, and comparison of IPF on Mindray with IPF on Sysmex series. So as we know that ESR is one of the most commonly advised and useful screening method, and the traditional method like Westergren method, it takes around 1 hour. So Mindray has come up with new technology in which the high-speed cyclic flow allows RBCs to disintegrate to a monodispersed state, and then there is a procedure by which the rigidity of the tubes allow these monodispersed cells to suddenly stop the disintegration, and then at constant speed, all the RBCs will start to re-aggregate, and that time is measured at the constant temperature. So in this, for segmentation of ESR, aggregation speed as well as degree is important. And in this, by photometric method, both degree and speed of aggregation is measured, and it increases the ESR determination by almost 90 seconds it takes to process both CBC and ESR. Material method for the study, the sample type used was leftover EDTA sample, whole blood samples. Instruments were Mindray BC 720, Westergren tube, and Sysmex XN. Calibration was done for the Mindray BC 720. Daily QC was run for both the instruments. Carryover study was performed. Precision studies for repeatability of the patient sample and reproducibility of the quality control was done, and comparison studies which would be discussed later. For carryover study, high target values were taken which had the ESR of more than 80, and low target value samples with ESR between 0 to 5 were taken. And then the study, they were run in the pair. High target values were run 3 consecutive times, followed immediately by the low target values. And then the carryover contamination rate was determined using the following formula. And the expected range is supposed to be less than 1. As we can see from this, the sample tested were well within the expected criteria of requirement of less than 1%. Next, the precision and repeatability of the patient sample was done. The ESR sample were collected of the following range, and which were according to the different ranges of ESR, the different level was done. And then the samples of above ranges were tested for 10 consecutive times. And the repeatability test was then done. The mean standard deviation and the coefficient of variation was calculated. As we can see, the acceptance criteria, The acceptance criteria for the ESR of the normal range 0 to 15 was less than 1.3 standard deviation, while for more than 15 was less than 9%. As we can see from this data, the lower level 1 and level 2, the SD is well within the reference, and for the ESR of higher levels, the CV is less than 9%. Similarly, the reproducibility for the patient sample was done for IPF, in which the different levels of low, high, and normal level samples were taken. The acceptance criteria for CV was less than 25%, and this was, in our study, it was well within the range. Then the reproducibility for the quality control sample was also done. In this, the BCQD quality control was tested in ESR mode, and also this was done 3 consecutive times, and after an interval of 5 to 12 hours, again the same QC sample was tested for 3 times for 5 consecutive days. And as we can see, the CV was between 0.90 to 1.43 for ESR, and for IPF it was between 3.1 to 6.8, which is a good CV. And so the comparison was, comparative study was done for 332 blood samples across the different ranges and clinical conditions on BC 720 and compared with manual Westergren method. And a total of 184 samples were run for comparison of IPF with the Sysmix machine. So for the comparison, first the passing block analysis was done. The total samples of 132 were taken from the reference range of minimum of 1 to the maximum of 135, and for the similar ranges were obtained on BC 700 also. The coefficient correlation was found to be 0.94, which is supposed to be good as it was more than 0.9 as the recommended criteria. Also, the bland Altman analysis was done to establish the arrangement between the Westergren and which is the gold standard, and the difference between the Mindray and the Westergren method. As we can see, the mean difference came to be 2.6. This was calculated for the absolute value for the normal samples. It was divided into 2 parts. One was for the normal ESR, in which the absolute values were calculated, and next was for the higher ESR values, for which the percentage values were calculated. As we can see, the mean difference in this was minus 3.56, which is mild underreporting was there in Mindray, and the SD was 28.9%. Also, the IPF comparison was done with passing Bablock analysis, in which the sample collected was number samples were 184 with minimum ranging for 0.7 to maximum 33 reference, and the similar reference was also obtained on BC 720. The coefficient of correlation was 0.868, which is within the required criteria, meets more than 0.8. Also, the bland Altman analysis was done for the same, and we found that the mean difference was minus 0.78 and OSD was 2.63. The conclusion from the study was the performance assessment criteria for the carryover studies, precision, repeatability, and reproducibility are met. ESR showed a good correlation coefficient of 0.94. Bland Altman analysis for the samples within the normal ESR showed minimal deviation, while for the ESR with high value, though mean bias was insignificant, standard deviation of 28.2% was noted. IPF sample showed good coefficient of correlation of 0.86. However, as IPF calculation algorithms on different instruments are different, instrument-specific normal range and clinical evaluation is recommended. I would like to acknowledge Mindray team, especially Dr. Kuku for study, who was the principal investigator, Bhavna for sample processing, Dr. Shama and Kirik and Yang for the study coordination and statistic analysis. And from the team, Sega Lab, Dr. Kunal sir, who is the principal investigator of the study, Dr. Manjusha and myself for sample coordinator, Pratidnya, Archana and Jyotsna for sample coordination. Thank you.
Thank you,
If there are any
Vasudha.
questions.
Thank you so much. Maybe one or two questions, Shama, can we allow? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, please. Yes, please.
So this one, it had 37 degrees was the temperature in the machine, inbuilt temperature. No, the Westergreen we will doing at 18 to the lab ambient temperature of the lab.
Ambient.
And the machine is at 37 degrees centigrade.
The machine is at 37. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vasudha. Thank you, Dr. Rama. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Now I'll invite Dr. Vinanti Golvilkar Patankar, Laboratory Director of AG Diagnostics, Pune. She's followed her father, late Dr. Golvilkar, and completed MD Pathology from BJMC. Her special interest is in the field of hematopathology and molecular diagnostics. Also, she happens to be my friend. I invite Dr. Vinanti Golvilkar for her talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to all from AG Diagnostics Private Limited, Pune. At the outset, I would like to thank Team Mindray and the organizers of Unveiling 2022 for giving me this opportunity. I would be covering a few case scenarios, not so uncommon in private laboratory settings, and I'm sure many of you would be able to identify with these situations. Most of the cases we encountered in private laboratory practice are like few pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and we are always struggling to get the complete picture. One such case we encountered at AG Diagnostics sometime in 2018. At that time, AG Diagnostics was a fairly new organization. This 40 years lady marched into the OPD complaining that all her reports done at our laboratory were wrong. You can imagine our dismay. I took her to my cabin, sat her down, tried to calm her down. She said that within a span of 10 days, her hemoglobin had jumped by almost 2 gram%. Her iron value had dropped down from a phenomenal 304 microgram per deciliter to a deficient 22 microgram per deciliter. Her glycated hemoglobin varied by more than 0.5% and did not correlate with her blood sugar values. And she claimed that she had taken no significant treatment whatsoever. So what were we looking at? Discrepant hemoglobin, discrepant iron, discrepant GHB and blood sugar, discrepant history, or the worst nightmare of all, a discrepant sample, a sample mix-up. At the same time, I called for her reports, review of her reports, and this was the data from the hematology analyzer. So this CBC was run on the 9th of July. It showed a hemoglobin of 9.1 gram% with a microcytic hypochromic blood picture, MCV of 66.2, and a wide RDW-CV value of 24.5%. On the RBC histogram, what I saw was there was a small hump towards the end of the histogram at about 100 femtoliters, which indicated the presence of reticulocytosis. So this hematology analyzer picture was pointing towards polychromasia, most possibly due to hematinic supplements, iron supplements, in a case of microcytic hypochromic anemia due to iron deficiency. However, on the same day, her iron studies revealed that her iron was deficient with a low iron and a raised TIBC, total iron binding capacity value. The HbHPLC, which was done on that day, revealed a normal HbHPLC pattern. and the GHB was 4.8 gram%. She had done iron with us a few days back on 30th of June, when her iron was very high, the value was reprocessed, with also an accompanying high TIBC. So this kind of picture in iron studies is typically seen after injectable iron supplement. However, she did not give any history of any injectable iron supplements. She said she had taken oral iron for a couple of days, after which she had discontinued the same too. On reviewing literature, I came to know that iron values as this could come up after oral iron supplementation when the blood testing is done at the time of peak absorption of iron from the GI tract. This was her previous CBC done on the 26th of June, which showed a hemoglobin value of 7.9 gram% with a microcytic hypochromic picture, MCV of 62.8, indicating iron deficiency. The GHB on that day, the 26th of June, was 5.4 gram%. However, on the 9th of July, it had come down to 4.8% due to the presence of reticulocytes in significant number in the sample on the 9th of July. We have a system of going through the delta check of the patients coming to us. Accordingly, this was what I had found from my ELIAS. The hemoglobin had actually gone up from 7.9 gram% to 9.1 gram%. Again, 7.9 is closer to 8, 9.1 closer to 9. So it was more like a raise of 1 gram% as against the impression the patient carried, 7.9 point, that it had gone up by almost 2 gram%. So when all this data was reviewed, we realized that it was none of these, and everything was falling into place like this. However, an important learning from this, I tried my level best to explain to the patient. I spoke to her clinician. However, the patient didn't seem to be convinced, and yes, she has not come back to us. So however right you are technically, the patient should also be convinced. Otherwise, it would be difficult to retain a patient. My next case is again a quite common scenario in our laboratories. So this was a 60 years female who had done test in one of our hospital labs with a complaint of fever for 2 days. Her CBC showed a platelet count of 97,000, so basically thrombocytopenia, with the presence of polymorphonuclear leukocytosis. Both were not going hand in hand. On closely looking at the WBC histogram, I saw a small hump before the lymphocyte peak, and the WBC scattergram did not show a clear-cut differentiation amongst the various WBC populations. On smear review at low power itself, we could pick up fibrin threads in the sample, and a fresh sample was requested. On receiving the fresh sample, expected, the platelet count came out to be 7,09,000. So it was in fact a case of thrombocytosis and not thrombocytopenia. Here, the WBC histogram and the scattergram showed well-differentiated WBC populations. This was the peripheral blood smear findings in the same case. I would say my presentation would remain incomplete without going through a few cases of thalassemia. And what I want to highlight through these cases is the various patterns that we see on our hematology analyzers. While they can help us, they can also be deceptive. So this was a 33 years female who had come for ANC workup. Her CBC showed a hemoglobin of 10.4 gram% with a microcytic hypochromic blood picture, RDW of 16.3, and a raised RBC count of 5.38 million. PBS confirmed the same findings. There were few target cells as well on the peripheral smear. The hemoglobin HPLC of the sample showed an A2 value of 5.2%, and this was a case of heterozygous beta thalassemia. Another case, 11 months female child, the CBC showed a hemoglobin of 5.1 gram% with a wide RDW, CV of 38%. The RBC histogram showed likewise wide distribution. The WBC scattergram showed an areas of cluster below the lymphocytes where there could be NRBCs and RBC fragments, debris. The peripheral blood picture corroborated these findings with presence of marked anisocytosis, poikilocytosis, micro-hypo picture, with the presence of moderate polychromasia and 5 to 6 NRBCs per 100 WBCs. HbHPLC was done in this case, showed hemoglobin F concentration of 93.2%, and this was suggestive of homozygous beta thalassemia. And now this case, 16 years female with no history of blood transfusion. Looking at the CBC, especially the RBC histogram, a hemoglobin of 3.8 gram% and RDW of 50%, wide RDW. Again, the WBC scattergram showing an area of debris below the lymphocyte counts. And in addition, this patient also showed leukopenia and thrombocytopenia. On the peripheral smear, there was marked aniso, poikilocytosis, microcytosis, hypochromia. But in addition, there was mild ovalocytosis and only mild polychromasia with occasional NRBCs. We did the HbHPLC in this case, and this showed A2 concentration of 6.1%, F 4.5%. This was suggesting heterozygous beta thalassemia. So, looking only at the hematology analyzer histograms was suggesting a beta thalassemia major, homozygous thal. However, this was a case of heterozygous beta thalassemia with a coexistent iron and B12 deficiency. With this, I would like to end my presentation. I would like to acknowledge my team at AG Diagnostics. This is the hematology department of our lab, and my entire team at AG Diagnostics. Thank you all for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Vinanti. We have next Dr. Jairam Iyengar, who is online. And I would like, if Dr. Jairam Iyengar is listening to us, there was a glitch in your video. So we would like to play it now, since it's running properly now. So is it okay if we run it now? Okay, sir is online. Thank you, sir. So I would request Dr. Ajay Shah to introduce Dr. Jairam Iyengar.
Good afternoon, sir. I will now introduce Dr. Jairam Iyengar, Managing Director, Anand Diagnostics Laboratory, and he will speak on CS80 and beyond, drivers of laboratory operational excellence. Sir, over to you.
Greetings to all from Bangalore.
All these
The plan for today's talk for the next 12 to 15 minutes is to highlight on the changing perspectives and perceptions of laboratory medicine and laboratory practice, and touch upon the concept of a laboratory value pyramid, which is something focused on customer satisfaction and what the lab needs to do for that. And before we begin, a few disclosures. That source of material is from the internet as well as from the in-house data that we've generated over the years, and the patient confidentiality is protected. As we are all aware, the early 20th century onwards, the medical laboratory was predominantly physician oriented, run by physicians. The results were used by the physicians for their own needs. But over the years, a lot has changed in the shape and function of the diagnostic laboratory. And the 21st century has actually thrown up a lot of challenges to the laboratory, both on the technical as well as on the operational areas. A lot of challenges have come up. The laboratory service has taken on the form of an industry. There is an increased pressure on cost containment. There is an increased demand to keep pace with the developments, which are occurring very, very rapidly. There's an increased pressure on error reduction and increased pressure on improving the quality services. There is an increased need to consolidate and automate laboratory processes, increased dependence on information technology, increased need for the evidence-based disease management, and last but not the least, a major aspect is the changing expectations of the end user or the customer, which has changed tremendously over the years. So in essence, the laboratory and the laboratory professional have moved from being a passive and a submissive entity into a sort of a consultant and almost like an active partner in the healthcare. So with this background, if you go to the baseline scenario of most of the laboratories in the current context where accreditation is quite, it's in vogue, and good equipment, good methodologies, regulations. With all of this, most of the laboratories have achieved a certain level of competence and performance. So what differentiates a good lab from the average lab or the not so very good lab? I think there the value add is the differentiator. The value add that the laboratory can provide over and above the baseline quality services differentiates a good lab from the not so very good lab. So in short, the service offered by the lab defines the reputation, and the better the lab is at this activity of delivering good customer service, at one stage probably the lab may not have any other peer to benchmark against, and the lab will need to benchmark against its own self or against its own performance. Looking at the lab customer footprint, we have the physicians, we have the patients, we have the community. We cannot forget the community as one of the consumers or the customers of the laboratory. And also we need to pay attention to our staff and meeting the requirements and exceeding the expectations of all these customers, I think matters a lot for the laboratory. Needless to say, the definition of quality as made by Edward Deming includes customer satisfaction. And among the CLSI quality management system essentials, 12 of them are there. Customer service is another important aspect. So with this in our mind, if we can quickly go through the concept of a laboratory value pyramid, which I have taken this concept from the internet. Basically, this looks at the various levels of customer satisfaction services that a laboratory can provide, starting from level 1 to level 4. So let's start with level 1 quickly. Most of the labs are on reactive mode. They identify errors, they identify non-conformities, do root cause analysis, and bring in corrective actions to ensure that the same errors do not recur. But then we need to move further beyond that. That proactivity, the culture of prevention, predicting that these are potential sources of error, and then plugging them, ensuring that these errors do not occur in the first place, takes a lab one step higher, and that would be the level 1 of the laboratory value pyramid. A constant analysis of the key performance indices along with the QI or QC data that takes the lab over the path of continual improvement. And initially the lab may need to engage external experts to help them in this process. So moving up one level to the level 2, the lab not only looks at its own internal processes, but will start looking for feedback from the outside, feedback from the customer. So the lab starts actively looking for the customer survey data and ways by which this survey data can be utilized for improvement. It moves from volume mentality to value mentality, and there are certain benchmarks it can create for itself. The lab shifts from a purely service-oriented mindset to a business mindset. And there is a tremendous focus on IT requirements, not only to improve lab processes, but to integrate all this data to deliver greater value outcomes. So this is what level 2 labs will be achieving. We'll dwell a lot more on the level 3 labs, where we have a slight shift from the internal viewing or internal focus to the external focus. The lab should become more proactive and drive improvements in informatics to create more value from the laboratory data and the laboratory consulting services. More and more active advisory services need to be given to the customers, which adds value to their management. The IT projects need to be supported. These IT projects that integrate essential lab patient information, and this converts into algorithms which add value to the patient. In essence, the lab shifts from being a service provider to a partner in healthcare. So let's go in detail about the clause of being proactive and driving improvements. The points I'd like to make here, what we have achieved over the years, the last 1 decade or so, there are a few examples in this area. We introduced serum protein electrophoresis as part of the extended liver package. Initially, a lot of people were wondering why we were doing this. Was it necessary? Is it just a business gimmick? But if you look at this chart here, the outcome of analysis over the last decade, you'll be surprised, in fact, to note that as much as 4% of all those so-called normal individuals who got a liver function test as part of their routine screening showed up abnormalities, M spikes on the serum protein electrophoresis. How many of these were actually myeloma? How many were MGUS is the next matter of investigation. But to let you know, in fact, just last week we picked up an incidental early myeloma in a patient who had come for a routine screen without any symptoms. So that definitely adds value to the customer and exceeds their C testing, introduction of anti-CCP along with rheumatoid factor assay, ionic calcium with total calcium, and so on. The other thing we did was we introduced diabetic retinopathy screening as part of the diabetes screening in association, in collaboration with Carl Zeiss. This was introduced in 2015, and we picked up a good number, about 12.6% of is apparently asymptomatic individuals were showing early signs of diabetic retinopathy. So that adds a huge value to the patient outcome. Then our physicians are very much tuned to picking up early variations in biochemical parameters when they come for review of their reports. And one such example, we picked up at least 12 cases of a primary hyperparathyroidism just based on the variations in their ionic calcium and the total calcium and reflex testing of the parathormone. So this again adds tremendous value to patient care. Now looking at IT projects to create algorithms, we have one major project which is nearing finalization, that is to use RBC indices to recommend whether the patient has iron deficiency or thalassemia, accordingly advise them for the appropriate investigations. And this actually went through a number of iterations and various steps in their validation. We use hemoglobin, MCH, RBC, MCV, and RDW as the predictor variables to help us predict whether the abnormal report falls into a classic iron deficiency, possible iron deficiency, classic beta thal, possible beta thal, or an overlap. We built distinct modules for male and females, and we built certain criteria for inclusion into the study. The roadmap was that we initially made a problem statement, then started retrieving our archived data, analyzing the data, clustered them into algorithms, built in certain predictive models to look at these parameters in the routine CBC and categorize them into any of these criteria or categories. And currently we are in a situation where we are almost finalized the validation of these algorithms, and we can actually launch these algorithms live into our reports. Advantage here is it brings in consistency and helps the pathologist actually bring in the advisory services to each and every abnormal hematology report. And this is how the prediction shows up on the screen where the pathologist would be reviewing the reports. Various other things which the data science has contributed. We have a full-fledged data science department now, manned by 4 individuals full-time, and we are working on various modules, including analytical modules and predictive modules. One of them is the critical alert reporting and documenting, predicting liver disease using the LFT results, predicting urologic disease using the urinalysis report, metabolic risk syndrome screening, sample TAT prediction. We are working on sample TAT prediction and critical alert reporting, kind of automating the process at this point. So these are the things which definitely go beyond customer expectations, where the laboratory would be very proactive in advising not only the patient, but also the physician as to what needs to be done next, what is the value of laboratory tests, how you can utilize these laboratory investigations to greater advantage of the patient. And the next step, once we've achieved this, once we have done excellent in this area, we only need to benchmark ourselves and see how we can do better than what we are doing at this point of time. So this, friends, is the concept of laboratory value pyramid. And this is the step which we need to follow and go up the ladder step by step to ensure that we can exceed our customer satisfaction. So I acknowledge the contributions of the data science department, Ms. Suma and Dattamurthy, and our physician, Dr. Ajit. Immense acumen is got, and he's very alert to pick up these early abnormalities. So he's contributed a lot to exceeding our customer satisfaction. So with this, I'd like to end my talk saying that exceeding customer satisfaction or expectations is where satisfaction ends and loyalty begins. So we can increase the number of our loyal customers by bringing in small changes in the way we start looking at our laboratory data and sharing this information with our customers. So thank you very much. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Hello. Thank you, sir. Is there any question? We can take up 1 or 2 questions, or
Sir is online, so if anybody has any queries right now, you can ask.
Okay, we will go for the next talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Please bear with me. Next speaker will be my last introduction as a chairperson. I will invite Dr. Anil Handu, very well known name in the industry. He is a Senior Director, Hospital Lab Services, BLK Max Hospital. Of course, he needs no introduction further. And without wasting time, more time for this, I will invite sir for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for kind introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. So my talk is Evolution of Hematology Analyzer Science, and what I'm going to be talking about is digital morphology the pinnacle? And why am I saying so is because that's the next thing which most of the people aspire for, the digital morphology nowadays. Okay, so there is a glitch already. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay, the quiz time. All right. So it's retro, isn't it? So tell me, and there is a prize for this, dinner on me tonight. Which movie? Absolutely, spot on. So the dinner is on, along with the retro theme. So roti, kapda and makan is what we have all known about. And in terms of hematology also, let's look at basic needs of life. Basic needs of life, roti, kapda or makan. Basic needs for CBC, hematology analyzer, microscope, slide and a counter. Yes or no? Then why the hell am I talking about digital morphology? Yeah? So, I am talking about digital morphology because many years ago, I was given a talk where I was supposed to talk about cell counter data, flags, and how do we define slide review rules. And mind you, I was talking about this somewhere in the 2012, 2013. And imagine these rules had come in 2005. So we were already about a decade later, nearly. And today, we are talking about digital morphology today, when digital morphology has been existing already for decades. So why? Because ye dil mange more, as simple as that. So we have desires, we have requirements, we have longings, we have cravings, we all want to do something new, something more, and that's where digital thing comes in. Imagine when I was a kid and I would watch sci-fi and I would look at somebody else, on the television, the one with the long ears, I'm forgetting his name. Yes, absolutely, spot on once again. So the guy would, look at the screen on front and would talk to somebody and we would think, oh my God, video calling, this is something which is, not possible. But is it possible today? Is it possible today? We just saw it, no? We were talking to Dr. Jairam. Yeah. So really, things are moving on, right? We are all wanting to digitize. We are all wanting to move on. And if you remember, Rajinikanth, favorite of Dr. Sukesh, this is the movie, Robo 3. Of course, he was showing us so many things in this movie, but we are talking here about digital morphology. So when we talk about complete blood count today, it's a routine test. We know that. Almost about 30 to 40% of tests in any laboratory is a CBC. And in a hematology laboratory, it will not be an exaggeration to say maybe 50% of our tests are complete blood counts in hematology. And what do? We screen. And the moment the number of samples go up, what's our worry? We are wanting to look at the peripheral blood film, right? And that's what, in fact, there is a lecture about this which says PBF is a window to the human body. May not be an exaggeration, because a lot of times you're able to actually pick up a lot of stuff in peripheral blood which people are actually oblivious to. So I'll start with white blood cells. Now, why white blood cells? White blood cells are like W for white and W for woman, and they are glamorous. The most glamorous cells in hematology are the WBCs, right? And they are most varied as well, just like any other woman. Extremely varied. So you need to figure out which WBC are you dealing with, right? And every time when you see a WBC, the variability amongst all of us is huge, right? Have you ever tried to see monocytes and myelocytes? Right? There are times when you classify one to the other, especially when they have some granulations here and there. So therefore, when you look at WBCs, this is one area where perhaps digitization would make it very, very good. Now we know that cell counter, we've been always professing about cell counter. All these years, we've been saying, let's get a cell counter, and cell counter will do our morphology. We talked about hemocytomorphometry. So what are we now trying to do? We are now trying to go back, the retro part of it, going back to morphology. And therefore, that's where the whole picture comes into the being. Now, what is your usual workflow for CBCs? You get a sample of blood, you push it into the analyzer, you get a printout out of that, you analyze either manually within your technical staff, or you have an algorithm based in your middleware, and you define whether you will make a smear or not make a smear. Yes? Yes or no? Yes. So we all do the same. And then eventually we review a smear, but that review has to be done by us. Majority of the pathologists will do it on the microscope, and then we will authenticate the report. So look at this. What do you have on the left-hand side here? The scatters, the histograms, and most importantly, the morphology. So morphology has not really moved on. Morphology has to be there. It is a part and parcel of our life. Now, as I was trying to prepare for this talk, I went through this very interesting article where it says, if I don't do morphology, it's blasphemy, right? And it says, and the Oscar goes to the peripheral blood film, right? So the Oscar still goes to the peripheral blood film, and therefore we need to have the blood film, which is nice, beautiful, having all its colors in the right proportions, and which can be accessed even when the slide has been discarded. So this is where the entire picture has come about. There's a lot of discussion about it, which ISLH has also been doing, ICSH has also been doing, and they, of course, have given us the slide review criteria to make the slides, to reduce the burden for us, and they've also started talking about how digital morphology is to be taken care of. How do you validate it, and how do you take about going ahead with the digital morphology today? So why did you have a cell counter at the first instance? Your aim was to reduce your manual labor and to reduce the work of reviewing the smears. Yes? But at the same time, you're also worried about missing your cases. There are cases wherein everything seemed to be normal and yet you had a small little parasite over there. Right? Now, what if I tell you that post-flagging, and if you want to see a smear, we go on to, from the manual microscopy that we were doing previously, where we were looking at the microscope, getting a slide made, looking at the blood film, getting these pictures into our mind, and eventually reporting it out, to something which is all digitized, which is all going on to a digital platform. And why am I professing for it so much? Since last 2.5 years, we've seen reaching the laboratory at times became a big challenge. And you would want to see a digital picture and give out the information. So this is the current workflow in any laboratory. You have a sample coming in. You are actually, getting your analyzer to work on it, getting the results, making a smear. Technical staff will review it. It'll reach you, and eventually you'll report. And sometimes you might want an expert opinion. To get the whole thing done, if I immediately put it onto an automated platform and get the whole thing done, my manual smear, the limitations with the manual smear review will go down markedly. And that's where it becomes useful for us. I'll not get into details of why digitization, because I've already explained the whole concept to you. And next comes the concept of artificial intelligence, which is what something Dr. Poonam showed us in one of her in the presentation, wherein artificial intelligence is actually having what is called deep machine learning, identifies cells on a regular basis. Dr. Mishra was talking about, having that bucket where the cells were not identified, and eventually trying to identify those cells subsequently as well. Yes, when you go into artificial intelligence mechanism, this whole concept keeps on evolving, and eventually you're able to get and differentiate between various cells. So this is a methodology which is used by Sictuple. There's also the methodology used by Cellavision, which I have had the opportunity of working on both the machines in my center. And in all of them, eventually you get to see your images appropriately. It eventually actually segregates the cells into various subtypes, and through the system of artificial intelligence is able to actually pinpoint few differential diagnoses, sometimes actual diagnosis. There was a question about bone marrow. Is it possible to review a bone marrow? So this is an article which I have pulled out from the internet, wherein they are looking at bone marrow morphology through the help of digital imaging and eventually artificial intelligence, and actually classifying the disease, wherein they were looking at morphology of megakaryocytes and looking at myeloproliferative neoplasms and telling you that yes, indeed, it could be an MPN. This is a study where again they have looked at, using the artificial intelligence, how they have clubbed diseases into various subgroups within the MPN group also, and even other leukemias. So is it possible to do this on a digital platform? In fact, it is only possible to do it on a digital platform. Because if you try to do it manually, you will take many, many man-hours, and that's why artificial intelligence and digital platform is here to stay. So when we talk about digital morphology and setup and its implications, a few things which we need to remember. We have to have, how do we select, what do we put on digital morphology? You can't have, you have 400 samples in a lab, all 400 cannot go onto a digital morphology. So you'll have to be very selective. Which ones do you choose? Do you want a whole mount image, or do you want selected areas to be looked at? Currently, if you look at majority of the digital platforms for hematology, they're not looking at the entire whole slide image. They're looking at selected areas which are put across to you. Of course, training, validation, and optimization is what needs to be done. But what is important at the end of the day, you're able to get clinical correlation or not. So the algorithms need to be defined. The inter-variability between the pathologists needs to be looked at. And most importantly, what you see in this picture on the right-hand side is the possibility of going across and getting second opinions. And that's what makes it very useful and beneficial. Just showing you a few quick case studies. These are a few from Sictuple, a few from the Cellavision, and some of them from the Mindray one, which we now have at our place. The one which Poonam showed you previously. This one is from Cellavision. Look at the clarity of images. Beautiful. You'll actually able to pick up cases, from remote access also. A chronic lymphoproliferative disease, plasma cell leukemia. Mind you, all these cells were actually very few in the entire smear, but they were picked up individually, and that's why you were able to pick them as a diagnosis. Look at the RBCs. We did see some of the presentations previously where microcytosis, poikilocytosis, etc. can be a challenge. However, the same thing when you see from a digital morphology imaging platform, all this can be picked up very easily and beautifully. Again, this is from Cellavision. Rouleau formation. Sickle cell disease. If you look at this picture, you may not be able to pick it out directly, but when you look at it from a near vision, you will be able to get your sickle cells, and they'll be picked up by the software on its own. Again, malaria. Somebody was asking about whether you can pick up, infections. Yes, you can. So there are a lot of things which can be done potentially. Of course, the toxic granulations, the Dole bodies, we saw all that in some of the presentations previously. Hairy cell, disc granulopoiesis, myeloblasts, dysplastic erythroid precursors, platelet and isochromia, something which most of us don't even bother looking at in a usual case. Again, satellitism, it's one of the most beautiful pictures that you see. We have recently had the opportunity of looking at this. It's still in the process of actually getting installed, and hopefully we will share something with you in near future. I believe they are claiming that they have a much better clarity, and I would like to work on it and see and give you possibly the information in my next cube. And the advantage which they have suggested is that there is a possibility of looking at platelets all along the entire breadth and the spread of the slide. So just to leave you all with the images to enjoy, and of course the tea which is waiting outside. These are the images from blasts, some normal lymphocytes, some other cells like the neutrophils and the eosinophils, etc. Myelocytes, and of course the faggot cell which you can see at the top, such beautiful images which eventually come out of these analyzers. So the take home, it helps you to standardize your system. You're able to automate, you're able to transmit images across to people, you're able to get second opinions on the data which is coming out from there. And of course, you can have what is called the electronic health records as well as improved turnaround times. I wish I would have had this digital platform earlier in my center because I wanted to look at a marrow today and I could have seen it here while delivering a talk here itself. Nevertheless, next time, for sure. And the final take homes, it is only as good as you give it to be. So if you don't have a good slide, we saw that in one of our experiments in our lab, wherein the slide quality itself really mattered. It started picking up certain globules within the glass as something which was abnormal, and later on we realized that we needed to change our slides. So it helped us in that as well. So we have to get good quality slides, stain it correctly, take an appropriate image, and only then are we able to classify and give the right information across for the patients. What is most important is, by this, I'm not trying to tell you that none of us is required. I think most of us are still required and will always be required, and it's the man behind the machine which actually is important to ensure that whatever the computerized algorithms come up, they are taken care of. While it may be important for us to realize when we go into a plane, a lot of times the pilot is actually just sipping coffee and doing nothing and putting the aeroplane in an autopilot mode. But just imagine if he's not there, you wouldn't take off. And if he is not there, you wouldn't land appropriately. So important point, man behind the machine is still very important. And hopefully, we all will digitize someday, and maybe we'll all share more digital images in the next cube. Thank you very much. Looking forward to any questions, and we can, after that, break for tea as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for taking us the journey of digital morphology and artificial intelligence. If there is any questions, we can have. Otherwise, we'll break for the tea.
No questions for you, Anil. You have handled it so brilliantly.
Thank you, sir.
No question. Just few comments. So you showed that beautiful diagram of pilot and the aircraft cockpit. So today you have drones doing all kinds of jobs which a pilot would have done. Now, other day, last month I was in the US, I saw one of those driverless cars. I think Elon Musk is going to be a trillionaire soon, not a billionaire. And the next thing is that Cellavision has a competitor now called Vision America, which is an Austrian company having the same thing what Cellavision has. So that's the comment.
So practically speaking, the more the merrier, sir. The more the competition, the cheaper it will be and more affordable it will be. I will not be talking about roti, kapda and makan. We'll all talk about why not have it today. And I think that's a great thing to happen. Competition actually helps you to grow. And it's always nice. And I'm sure even Parag will agree with that. Oh, okay, fine. So Dr. Sukesh wants to come live for a minute. Yep. So please get him online.
So, Anil, thanks for that nice presentation. So, when COVID struck, the workload in CMC had come from 100% to 20%. So there was too many consultants. So I decided to shift to another hospital, which CMC had started in the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh in Chittoor, which is about 30 kilometers. And I started practicing there. It's a new hospital, potentially a new medical school, and a new community. So I thought that good place to go and influence practice. I received about we used to receive about 250 samples a day, and I think because we had some good relationship with Beckman Coulter at that time, they had actually completely manned the entire lab with all the advanced automation. So I decided that why are we not having an automated slide maker and stainer here? Then over a period of time, I realized that 250 samples a day. Can you imagine my slide review rate? I used to see 1 to 2 slides per week. 1 to 2 slides per week. So my concept of slide review rate was completely, traumatized by that experience, and I could influence practice significantly. So I told Joy that no need for a slide maker stainer because there is no need. Only when there's a malaria, probably we have to make a slide because it's a reportable disease. We have to this thing. Even leukemias, some of them were so straightforward from the cell counter that, of course, there was no ability to manage leukemias in Chittoor, so we had to send them to Vellore. But we could make a diagnosis. So thing is, I realized, like for example, Schistocytes was behind Joy for looking at some validation, and I told, you can do it if you want, but I'm not going to pitch in. So probably, and you mentioned about the talk that you gave about slide review rate. I was quite happy because you remember that we both initiated that that synthesis that happened on slide review rate. But I was seeing 1 to 2 slides per week. So that was a huge, it was like something really struck me back. Of course, bone marrow morphology, because bone marrow has to be seen under the microscope, and also histopathology has to be seen. There is a huge role for this. But bone marrow follows a peripheral blood examination, and when peripheral blood examination gives a lot of information, and when I saw that my slide review rate was very, very low, and it was completely, I don't know. I'll probably develop it in CMC also and see how this can be followed, because CMC is more complex than Chittoor. Chittoor is an early place, and we'll probably do a study and see whether a publishable study and see whether what is a true slide review rate in when a lot of new parameters are coming on cell counters. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, one question, sir. I'm Dr. P.K. Gupta from Lucknow. And just a question for you. How to counter the corporatization of pathology? Because we are running a single solo establishment, and we are facing the challenge. So how to counter? What will be the message from your side?
So I think when two people have similar pain, it is better that they sit outside in retro and then decide what we will do for this. Okay, we'll sit together tonight in the retro and then decide what we'll do for this. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Ajay Shah.
If you can see the camera can see you. Remember that. So ensure that you look at the camera. Superb. Okay. Now, do some different emotions. Okay, look here. Are you ready? Everybody, when I say 1, 2, 3, I want you to give me a yeah. 1, 2, 3. Wow, that's a good yeah. Everybody, when I say 1, 2, 3, right hand up, dancing. 1, 2, 3. Everybody, when I say 1, 2, 3, right hand, keep it up, and left hand, both the hands. Great. Now, everybody, when I say 1, 2, 3, सामने वाले को लात मारो. 1, 2, 3. Superb. Okay. Everybody, when I say 1, 2, 3, especially the guys and girls who are standing, jump. 1, 2, 3, jump. Superb. Very good. Everybody, look at your partner and say, hey, hey, hey. Superb. Everybody say, I love Mindray. I love BLK. Only ladies say, I love Lomi. Okay. Give yourselves a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, my dear doctors, my dear friends. Love you all. Thank you. Stay there only. We are having the meetings, the sessions here. The audience is there. And for the next 2 hours. Okay, thank you. Thank you. You may disperse. You are so cooperative. Very good. Organize next 3 minutes. I'm going to give 3 of you prizes. All you got to do is pay attention. Will you do that? You don't want the prizes? You don't want the prizes. Okay, thank you. Take them back. You really don't want the prizes. Okay, here we go. Spot prize. Listen very carefully. What is unique? How many of you were at Cube 2019? Many of you. How many of you remember seeing me at Cube 2019? 1, 2, 3. The cameraman remembers seeing me. 4, 5. Okay. How many of you remember what was my dress code in 2019? What did I wear in 2019? Black suit. Okay, 1. Hang on. Who else remembers what is unique between 2019 and 2022 where my dress sense was concerned? Come on, I'll give you a prize. Same? Same tie. Hang on, I won't tell you it's correct or wrong. Who else remembers? I need something better than that. I'll show you myself. I need a perfect, complete, sumptuous answer. Come on, quickly, before I count 10. Same? Same beard. Thank you. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You said black suit. One of the days I wore a black suit. You said same tie. It's not only same tie. Everything what you see here was exactly the same which I wore in Cube 2019, including the blazer, the tie, the cravat, the shirt, the trousers, and even the shoes. You'll be surprised, and even the shoes. So 3 years on, I'm the same weight, and I don't feel shy to wear the same clothes because this is Cube. So give yourselves a big hand, and you please come here, doctor, and you please come here because I'm going to give you a prize. May I invite Dr. Handy to kindly please come and give you the prizes, please? Come on the stage, quickly. We are starting the session in 1 minute. Dr. Shehnaz, please come up. Sir, what's your name?
I was actually going to say the same.
Why didn't you say it? Dr. Shehnaz gets the prize for remembering 3 years ago I wore the same tie. Give them a big round of applause. Thank you. And Dr. Amit Shah remembers that on one day I had worn a black blazer, which was absolutely right. Big round of applause to both of you. Give him an extra. I'll stay away from that. Thank you, Dr. Handu. Okay. Hey, give me that paper. So we move on to our serious business sessions. I think we are 30 minutes late. So 4:30 to 4:45 p.m. it was supposed to be that, and now we're delayed for almost 55 minutes. Dr. Arpan Mehta, are you here, Dr. Arpan Mehta? Yes. You are here. Head of Pathology Department, Slupatek, Newburgh, Ahmedabad, will speak on 2012 and 2021 ICSG guidelines for something I can't pronounce, and FRC case study.
Yes, so very good evening to all of you. Thank you so much, CUBE team, for considering me. So I shall be talking on quantification of schistocytes. Yes, so here is how I'll be going about it. So first we'll talk what are schistocytes, how do they look, how to count them, whether to call them or not call them, in which conditions do we see them, as well as an FRC parameter, which is a newer parameter which is given by few hematology analyzers. So what are schistocytes? So the name is derived from Greek word schisto, meaning broken or cleft. And they are actually circulating fragments of red blood cells or RBCs from which cytoplasmic fragments have been lost. And they are formed as a result of mechanical damage which happens to the membrane, which is caused by fibrin strands on the endothelial surfaces and or by turbulence of blood. So this is just a short animation showing the same. So suppose this is a blood vessel and this is an RBC, it traverses through and fibrin strand tears it apart. So this is a similar thing on a different angle. So basically, how do they look? So long back there was a considerable confusion, or rather lack of consensus as to which cells we should call as schistocytes. So 2012 recommendations were given up by ICSH. So they told how to identify schistocytes, in which conditions do they have value, and how to count them. And now there is a recent update in 2021, similar on the sides of 2012 recommendations. So according to ICSH, schistocytes are always smaller than red blood cells and should be defined as one of the 4 types. So the first variety is the smaller variety. So they are small fragments of varying shape, sometimes with sharp angles or spines, in which case we call them as triangular forms, with straight borders, or sometimes with round outline on one side, in which case we call them as microcrescents. Often distorted, usually staining darkly, and occasionally pale as a result of loss of hemoglobin. So here what you look at is a microcrescent. The second variety is slightly larger, so they are helmet cells as we call them, which are damaged RBCs with one single or rarely a double amputated zone, highlighted by a straight border with sharp angulated edges, and the missing cell portion corresponds to fragments that are split off. So here is a helmet cell. Coming to third variety, so these are even larger cells. So these are damaged cells, larger, having a pair of spicules separated by a semicircular concave segment of membrane, sometimes even 2 or 3 pairs. So they are named as keratocytes, or cells with horns. And they are formed as a rupture of one or more peripheral pseudovacuoles and subsequent fusion of cell membranes. So here is a keratocyte. Coming to last type, these are small sized hyperdense RBCs with a round shape and increased staining. We all know them. They are microspherocytes, and they are secondary manifestation of fragmentation. The most important is they should be included only and only if we see other forms together. Then only we need to count them. So this is how they look. So this is a keratocyte. This is a helmet cell. This is a triangle schistocyte. These are microspherocytes. This is a helmet cell. This is a microspherocyte. This is a keratocyte. This is a microcrescent. And these are other schistocytes. Now in which conditions we call them or not. So here these are spherocytes and we will not call them since we are not seeing other types of schistocytes. These are irregularly contracted cells and we will not call them. Again, these are acanthocytes, so we will not call them as schistocytes. These are sickle cells and we will not call them as schistocytes. So this we need to differentiate from microcrescents, which are small in size, and these are larger than red blood cells. So these are few other examples. So these we will call them as schistocytes since they are helmet cells. These look like acanthocytes and these are triangle forms. So we will count this but not this. So these are again irregularly contracted cells and acanthocyte-like cells, and this is a crescent, so we will count them. So we all know that it is possible only to count if we have a good smear. If your procedure is not good or the slide is not good, then we will not be able to identify that. So in 2021, again they have reiterated the fact that standard procedures for smearing and staining blood films is essential. And they have also kept a point saying that these are stable only till 3 hours of blood collection at room temperature, and if you are keeping at 4 degrees, then they are stable. These findings are stable rather till 8 hours at 4 degrees centigrade. Now how do we count them? So first of all, we select an area where RBCs are just overlapping. Of course, that is the subtail region. We don't need to go towards the feathered edge where we see only spherocytes. So once we focus that, we go till in oil immersion, and then we count the number of RBCs and schistocytes. And then we put up in this formula and we get the result. It is that simple. So recommendation is to count at least 1000 cells. So this is a Rumke distribution table which shows the confidence limits of an observed percentage of schistocytes depending on the number of RBCs that we count. So If the true value is 1%, and if we count only 100 RBCs, then we can get a value anywhere between 0 to 5.4, which is a very wide range. So to increase the confidence limits, we count 1000 red blood cells, where the limit narrows down, or the range rather narrows down. And if we want to even get a better precision, then we need to count 10,000 red blood cells. So the recommendation is to count at least 1000 red blood cells, and preferably 10,000. But is it easy to count 10,000? Well, the time needed for counting even 1000 red blood cells is estimated to be on average 10 minutes. So the real world application is difficult. So ICSH recommends a 1000 cell count as a best balance between the precision required versus the time and resources that we have. So this is just practically how we can count. So this is just a field which I have shown. Of course, we need to select a field where RBCs are just overlapping and not as sparse as this. This is just for demonstration purpose. So we can have an imaginary lines like this and start counting red blood cells in one and multiply it by 4. And if we want a better precision, then we need to count in all 4. And thus we can get average number of red blood cells in one field. Important thing to note here is we need to select in whichever fields we are going to go. We need to have an idea that we are going to get, or we are going to see RBCs, means fields with RBCs which are similar. So similar in number. So we cannot go with such sparse fields and then dense fields like that. So once we have an average number of red blood cells, we start counting the schistocytes, and we count the number of schistocytes and then the number of fields in which we have counted those schistocytes. So we have 3 values, and we put and we get the result. So it is said that an average field would have about 200 red blood cells if it is a well-made blood field, and if you select an average area, it will have 200. So if we want to count 10,000, we need to select 50 fields, count the number of schistocytes, and usually it takes roughly 8 to 10 minutes, and you are done. So this is the distribution of type of schistocytes. So as you can see, helmets, crescents, and microcrescents are the predominant forms of schistocytes, while triangle forms, keratocytes, and microspherocytes are the less predominant forms. As you can see, schistocytes are not only seen in microangiopathic hemolytic anemias, but they are also seen in hematological malignancies, even megaloblastic anemias. You can see in carcinomas, renal failures, infections, etc. So important thing to note here is that even these conditions can have thrombocytopenias. So the presence of schistocytes, even if associated with severe thrombocytopenia, may not specifically identify cases of thrombotic microangiopathy. So you need to see the clinical context, as well as you need to see whether schistocyte is the predominant abnormality. And even conversely, lack of schistocytosis does not exclude the diagnosis of thrombotic microangiopathy, in which case if you still have clinical suspicion, we need to examine the films daily, because there are case reports in which there is absence of schistocytosis, even if that is a case of thrombotic microangiopathy. Like this is the case of megaloblastic anemia, and you are seeing lot of schistocytes here and there. But that is not the predominant abnormality. Predominant abnormality here are macrovalocytes, hypersegmented neutrophil, Howell-Jolly bodies. So this is a case of megaloblastic anemia. So we need to report these qualitatively. So these are the upper limits which were given in 2012 recommendations. So in healthy adults, it is like till 0.2% you can see. Neonates, you see higher, it is 1.9%. And even in premature neonates, you see till 5.5%. So cutoff is defined only for 2 clinically significant conditions, and that is thrombotic microangiopathy, which is capped at 1%, and transplant-associated thrombotic microangiopathy, which is capped at about 4%. In other cases, whenever you see schistocyte as not the predominant abnormality, it should be graded qualitatively and mentioned in the final report that is not the predominant abnormality. These are the recommendations. In 2021, they have kept 2 things as healthy adults and full-term neonates at 1%, which was similar to before, and premature babies at 5%. And whenever you are grading qualitatively, you can follow 2015 recommendations, in which it is 1 plus when less than 1%, 2 plus 1 to 2%, and 3 plus at more than 2%. So this is a Bland and Altman plot, which is showing inter-observer differences between 2 observers. And you can see there is a good overall agreement at lower schistocyte percentages between 2 observers. So this is an approach which is given in 2021 recommendations. So whenever you have a clinical suspicion of thrombotic microangiopathy, or you have positive FRC, which I'll be talking about, then you need to see the blood film and see whether schistocytes are present or not. If they are present, we need to see whether it is the predominant abnormality. If it is not, and still you have strong clinical suspicion, like I told before, we need to examine daily. If not, then we need to think about other diagnosis. If it is the predominant abnormality, then like I showed, we count about 1000 red blood cells and determine if it falls below the cutoff, then it is unlikely thrombotic microangiopathy, and if else, it is TMA. Coming to automation, the FRC percentage as well as absolute count, which is given by few automated hematology analyzers, it has advantages in that it is having good reproducibility in contrast to manual counts, where you can have some differences. Here, approximately 30,000 red blood cells are counted, as compared to manual, in which we count pretty less. They are available within minutes. You run them and you get the result. It does not require morphology evaluation by an expert pathologist. It has good sensitivity and negative predictive value. However, it comes with limitations in that it overestimates as well as underestimates. It is affected by hypochromia. It has very low specificity, and it is not recommended to be used only in isolation. So this is one of the hematology analyzers. Here, it is dependent on integrated analysis of erythrocytes and platelets, where FRC corresponds to refractive index more than 1.4 and volume less than 30 femtoliters. This is the second hematology analyzer. This is Sysmex. So here on x-axis you can see RNA content, in y-axis you can see the forward scatter, where these are the mature red blood cells having higher forward scatter, and these are platelets with lower forward scatter. So you determine a gate here, and then that is here. So this separates RBCs from platelets, and then there is a gate here with lower forward scatter and lower fluorescence. So this determines, if you take this percentage with respect to all red blood cells, you will get the schistocyte percentage. In addition to this, there is another gate here, which is called as microerythrocyte distribution area, in which microcytic red blood cells fall. So if it is above a certain limit, it will autocorrect. So these are the reference ranges given for FRCs. So predominantly studies are done on Sysmex and ADVIA. And it is found that means or medians fall between 0.2 to 0.4, and we call abnormal result when we get more than 0.5%. So this again, it has a very low specificity, so that means it will give higher false positives, but as you can see, it gives very good sensitivity and very good negative predictive value, meaning thereby that if you have lower automated FRC counts, that means there is very less possibility that there are schistocytes in the blood film. So this is just a case I made up yesterday. So this was a 12 years female with a suspected case of HUS that we had got. So we followed it up for like 9 to 10 days, and we saw schistocytes decreasing from 12.3% to 1.95%, and likewise FRC and FRC percentage and absolute counts decreasing proportionately. Likewise NRBCs disappearing after some time of plasmapheresis. So as you can see, there is a very good trend line which are developing. So based on all the findings and papers and all, 2021 recommendations gave evidence-based statements for FRC, and they told that FRC results and flags are a helpful screening test and not confirmatory test. The absence of FRC is a valuable parameter to exclude schistocytes, but when MCV is high, it can give false negative. Multi-center studies are required to generate a reference range, and samples with positive FRC count should be reviewed by optical microscopy. So a schistocyte count has definite clinical value in TMA in absence of additional severe red cell shape abnormalities with a confident threshold value of 1%. And automated counting of RBC fragments is also recommended by ICSH working group as a complement to the microscope according to the high predictive value of negative results. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arpan. Any questions for Dr. Arpan? There are some online questions, Dr. Arpan. In which clinical condition schistocytes are significant specifically?
Okay, so like I told you, basically in two conditions. One is thrombotic microangiopathy, in which we can see TTP or HUS, so thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, and hemolytic uremic syndrome. And another one is TA, transplant-associated thrombotic microangiopathy, in which case we keep thresholds at 4%, and in thrombotic microangiopathies isolated, we keep at 1%.
I think, Nikhil, are there any more questions? Okay. Thank you,
you.
Dr. Arpan. Thank you very much. May I call upon stage Dr. Shahnaz Khodaiji to chair the sessions ahead.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone at Mindray for inviting me to chair this forthcoming session. And it's particularly my pleasure to chair this session because the two people I know very well and interact with are going to be speaking. First is Pradeep Suri. So the first speaker is Dr. Pradeep Suri, who is director of Dr. Suri Labs Private Limited in New Delhi. He manages a standalone lab of very high quality. We've known that because time and again he keeps researching all the parameters and presenting them to us, and we learn a lot from him always. It's a high quality diagnostic laboratory with technical details and quality management. Over to you. Thank you. Dr. Pradeep Suri.
At the outside, I'd like to thank the Mindray team and Dr. Anil Handu for giving me this opportunity. The topic that I'm going to speak today is hematological markers in COVID-19 and sepsis. I would like to start with a disclaimer that, talking about both the topics in 10 minutes is a little difficult, but I'll try to cover as many salient points as possible. So basically, we did this study in the first wave of COVID itself, where there were a host of inflammatory markers that we were studying, and we wanted to look whether there are some hematological markers which could correlate these pro-inflammatory markers. So the first marker was CRP, which was the most potent marker to look for, severity or aggravation of severe and moderate COVID. And usually an average of 20 to 50 mg per liter had a good correlation of progressing to moderate to severe COVID. So this is one of the parameters that we studied along with the hematological markers. The next acute phase reactant that we studied was ferritin. Ferritin is not only an acute phase reactant, but is also involved in iron metabolism. And it had a significant prognostic role to determine, especially serially rising ferritin levels of doubling in less than 12 to 24 hours, had a direct correlation with COVID storm. Then we also looked at interleukin 6 or IL-6, which is a potential predictor of detecting COVID storm at a value of 10x over the normal range. And at a cutoff of 24 pg per ml, it showed an initial excellent assessment for progression to moderate to severe disease. We also looked at lactate dehydrogenase. This is an important marker. It has got a 6-fold increase odds of developing severe disease at a high level and had a 16-fold increase in odds of mortality in severe COVID disease. So LDH was the single most important marker in predicting mortality in COVID patients. And last but not the least, we also correlated with D-dimer, which was also, apart from being a pro-inflammatory marker, was also a pro-coagulant marker. And its meaningful prognosis was at a cutoff of 2 mg per liter. Sorry. So the objective of our study was twofold. A, to establish correlation between hematological parameters and the inflammatory markers. And B, to try to establish the most useful hematological parameters that could be used for COVID-19 prognosis. So the materials that we used here were, we did the CRP and LDH using Cobas Integra, ferritin using Abbott Architect chemiluminescence system, interleukin 6 using the Beckman axis. This pointer is not working. Okay. D-dimer using the VIDAS, RT-PCR using Bio-Rad CFX96 amplification system and ZBO extraction, and last but not the least, CBC with retic count using Mindray BC 6800 plus. So what we adopted was a simple 4-step methodology. In step 1, patients who were RT-PCR positive for COVID-19 were selected in the scope of study. In step 2, we only took patients who had got both CBC and the 5 inflammatory markers done. All the other patients were excluded from the study. Step 3, we also asked for the history of corticosteroid intake, and the group was further filtered to include those patients who had not taken steroid, because steroid itself leads to neutrophilic leukocytosis which shift to left, and we did not want to bias our study with the effect of corticosteroid. And then we performed the CBC parameters for all these patients and did an unpaired t-test against each of these inflammatory markers and divided them into 2 groups, low inflammatory marker and high inflammatory marker. So, do you have a pointer? Yeah, thanks. So the first group is CRP. We divided into 2 groups, CRP less than 20 and CRP more than 20. And the parameters that we studied were absolute lymphocyte count, absolute neutrophil count, RDW, both CV and SD, immature platelet fraction, NEUT-Y, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, immature granulocytes, HFC, immature reticulocyte fraction, and mono-Z. So as you can see, the 3 parameters that stood out were absolute lymphocyte count, absolute neutrophil count, and neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. The mean values in CRP less than 20 were 1.9 and 1.2 respectively for ALC, 5.4 and 6.3 for ANC, and 3.7 and 7.2 for NLR. So these were the 3 important hematological parameters which correlated well with the CRP. Next, coming to ferritin, again we divided into 2 groups, ferritin less than 300, ferritin more than 300. Again, 2 of the markers are common, absolute lymphocyte count 1.8 and 1.3, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio 4 and 6.7, pretty similar to CRP. However, an interesting finding was that the HFC was increased in group where ferritin was more than 300. Ferritin is an interesting marker. It is not only pro-inflammatory, it is also an anti-inflammatory marker. So, sometime rising ferritin also gave, knowledge about patient recovery also, apart from the fact that high ferritin could also cause cytokine storm. So, it is a double-edged sword. Next, we did LDH, again pretty similar to CRP. The absolute lymphocyte count, absolute neutrophil count, and NLR were the 3 parameters where there was a significant difference at a cutoff of 350. Next, IL-6, again absolute lymphocyte count and NLR were the 2 markers which were showing significant difference, and HFC, like ferritin, also showed significant difference at an ILC less than 24 and more than 24. So pretty much in all these 4 inflammatory markers, ANC, ALC, HFC and NLR were the 4 hematological parameters that were most useful. However, D-dimer springed up a surprise. So in D-dimer there was not much difference between the 2 groups, D-dimer less than 1 and more than 1, barring immature reticulocyte fraction which showed a significant difference. In D-dimer less than 1 it was 10.8 and in D-dimer more than 1 it was 16.5. However, we don't know the reason for it. So next we did a t-test, and as you can see, the p-value for CRP versus NLR was extremely significant, and the mean value for CRP greater than 20 was 7.25 and less than 20 was 3.77. So around a cutoff of around 4 NLR, you could differentiate mild from moderate to severe COVID disease. Next, CRP versus absolute lymphocyte count, again the p-value was extremely significant, and the mean value for CRP less than 20 was 1.76 and 1.22 for more than 20. Again, CRP versus absolute neutrophil count, again extremely significant. Ferritin versus absolute lymphocyte count, the p-value was again extremely significant. Ferritin versus HFC, the p-value was again extremely significant. Ferritin versus NLR, again extremely significant. Interleukin 6 versus absolute lymphocyte count, again extremely significant. IL-6 versus neutrophil lymphocyte NLR, it was not as significant as CRP, but still it was significant. IL-6 versus HFC, again extremely significant. D-dimer versus immature reticulocyte fraction, p-value was extremely significant. And the mean value in the D-dimer less than 1 was 10.8 and in more than 1 was 16.48. Clearly, the IRF values were higher in patients with D-dimer more than 1. CRP versus HFC, it was mildly significant, not that significant. But an interesting observation, all patients in whom HFC percentage was more than 1%, all of them showed some amount of recovery from symptoms of COVID within 48 hours. So an HFC more than 1% is actually a good prognostic marker for COVID. CRP versus NUT-Y, again mildly significant. So NUT-Y did not show a very good significance in both CRP less than 20 and more than 20. Ferritin versus absolute neutrophil count, again mildly significant. So the conclusion of our study was that absolute lymphocyte count, absolute neutrophil count, NLR and HFC were the best prognostic markers, and they showed excellent correlation for most of the inflammatory markers, barring the D-dimer. NLR was the most efficacious marker amongst them all, the various parameters analyzed, and at a cutoff of 4, there was a robust sensitivity and specificity to different mild COVID from moderate to severe COVID. Immature reticulocyte fraction showed excellent correlation with D-dimer, but not other inflammatory markers. This could be a topic for further research. Next, this is our paper predicting developing sepsis, which we presented at ISLH Melbourne, but this is a paper which predates the COVID paper because that time COVID was nowhere in the window. So what we did here was, the object of this study was to evaluate novel hematological parameters like NUT-Y, MonoZ, NLR and IMG, and to try and see if any of them could differentiate bacteremia from septicemia, and also to assess if any of these markers could predict severity of sepsis, or it could be used a marker in treatment or prognosis similar to procalcitonin. So again, the material that we used were, we did the procalcitonin using Mindray CL96I, the hematological parameters using Mindray BC 6800 plus, and blood culture using platelet from bioMérieux. So what we adopted was again a 4-step methodology. All the blood samples, normal range was established for all these novel parameters, NUT-Y, MonoZ, IMG and NLR. And then all patients of pyrexia who had given both CBC and blood culture were included in the study. And only those patients were taken who had at least 2 diagnostic criteria from the surviving sepsis guidelines. All patients who were blood culture negative were further excluded from the study. And at this stage we had 70 samples, and we calculated the Uden index and the ROC curve to see the cutoff where you could maximize the specificity and sensitivity of each of the variable. So this is the Uden's index. The 2 parameters which showed the best results were NUT-Y. In NUT-Y, the cutoff between bacteremia and septicemia was 492, and it had showed robust sensitivity and specificity. And for NLR, the cutoff was 10.66, and again it showed good sensitivity and specificity. So coming to diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, the diagnostic sensitivity of NUT-Y was 100 and specificity was 93%, whereas the diagnostic sensitivity of NLR was 86% and specificity was 100%. So we can say that the NUT-Y was the most sensitive markers in differentiating bacteremia from septicemia, whereas NLR was the most specific marker. So, although both of them were promising markers for early sepsis, but none of them could predict the severity of sepsis, which means that as the sepsis became more severe, it was not like the NUT-Y or the NLR was increasing multifold like a procalcitonin. So it was not a substitute for procalcitonin to predict the severity of sepsis. One more thing I would like to say, that although NLR is increased in both COVID and sepsis, but the mechanism is very different. In COVID, NLR is primarily increasing because of lymphopenia and the resulting relative neutrophilia. Whereas in sepsis, the NLR is primarily increasing because of neutrophilic leukocytosis which shift to left. That is one of the reasons why NUT-Y is showing good sensitivity and specificity in sepsis, but is not showing that good sensitivity and specificity for COVID. So with these words, I'd like to thank you all. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Suri, for that very wonderful and lucid talk, and really you have studied so many parameters, very useful, and I can see one hand up for the first time. I'm so happy someone's asking a question.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ruchi. I'm the consultant hematologist in Toprani Lab, Baroda. Actually, I just want to add on one more point to this. One of the very earliest marker in COVID-19, that is eosinopenia.
Yes.
That is very, very common at this very early phase that eosinopenia develop. When the absolute value count is less than 20, we should suspect sepsis or a COVID-19. In COVID, this last 2 years, we were like, we got samples from 2 COVID centers to our lab, and each and every patient, they had 0 count of eosinophils. So that was the major draw. We saw that in many patients, and it was a case like in our lab also, somebody does CBC from our staff, and that is eosinopenia. That means he should or she should go to the home. It is like a very early marker, and it should be included.
I agree.
Yeah, that's right. Eosinopenia is a very age-old marker for sepsis, but have you validated it, and have you found the significance?
Yeah, I've
and have you
got a
validated
few
it?
articles related
Because
to it.
mostly it's anecdotal. People do notice, and it is noticeable, but one needs to work it up and establish a significance basically. But it's a helpful clinical marker, no doubt. Yes, Madam Mamta Soni.
Actually, eosinopenia, we conducted a study in our hospital, some 650 cases, and we got very, very promising results. Eosinopenia is definitely an early predictive marker for COVID-19, as she rightly said, and it also helps to kind of, quarantine those people, segregate those people till you get final confirmatory result from RT-PCR lab. And this paper has been published in IJLH. So yes, it has been objectively validated. Other than eosinopenia, also RDW, red cell distribution with also the same paper. I think I took a study on some 700 samples, patient samples. That is also published as a letter to editor in IJLH. And it is a promising prognostic indicator for COVID-19 infection. So these two, and of course D-dimer. D-dimer also, we published the study in diabetic and nephropathic journal, because it was very, very kind of predictive, especially in diabetic patients. And we got similar results like Dr. Suri, more than 2 is kind of a predictor for negative prognosis. I mean, these patients don't do all that well. So yes, eosinopenia, right, Dr. Ruchi, and we took up a study, and it's like one of the very highly cited papers.
Yes, you
so
published.
I think the world is looking at eosinopenia and RDW, and very, very helpful in resource limited setting like India, where immediately we can't kind of get an RT-PCR done. Just on a simple CBC, we can at least segregate those patients before we take up the further work.
True.
Thank you.
Yes.
We read your paper also.
Dr. Ruma.
Yeah, further to eosinopenia, neonatal sepsis. Absolutely, I depend on eosinophils. If eosinopenia and you have the band cells, please, that baby is septic, definitely. And there are certain permutation combinations we have all worked out. Less than 5 days and more than 5 days. But eosinopenia is one thing which has to be there before you call it a septic baby also. So besides COVID, you have other conditions, and especially neonates. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Dr. Suri, your talk has generated a lot of questions and a lot of interest. Anybody else?
Dr. I must compliment him for this excellent study during the COVID period, where nothing else was happening. So I just have one suggestion, that you have done bivariate analysis. Why don't you do a multivariate analysis of all the variables?
Pardon, sir? Come again, sir.
I said you have mostly done bivariate analysis, saying one is superior to the other in terms of identifying something, sepsis or no sepsis. So why don't you do a multivariate analysis of your different parameters?
You're talking about the sepsis studies or the COVID studies?
Like come up with some algorithm between all these parameters.
Because you see, whenever in the second study you showed your objective. The objective was very nice. In the first study, you have multiple parameters and you have just compared two parameters at one time.
No, sir, we compared everything. We are only showing you the ones that were significant.
No, I understand, but you haven't done a multivariate analysis of the different parameters.
No, sir, I am not comparing an inflammatory marker to another inflammatory marker. I am comparing the inflammatory marker to the hematological markers. So we've done a plethora of hematological markers.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So you are trying to show the significance between two markers, and you are calculating the p-value between two parameters at one time.
Yes, sir.
So if you do a multivariate analysis, or the statistical strength of multivariate analysis is far superior to bivariate analysis.
Okay.
So since you have studied so many parameters, why don't you do a multivariate analysis and see which are the two markers which are significant, and those are the two you recommend to be done. There may be a third or a fourth marker which may be beneficial, but in the multivariate analysis they may be losing out. But between two parameters, one may be superior to the other.
Okay, so we'll apply another statistical tools.
Also, maybe all the most significant parameters can be taken together and a kind of algorithm derived, like one figure can be calculated, so it becomes easier.
No, we have calculated cutoff points for everything. Yeah.
But so, also there is a way in which you can probably take all the parameters and do some kind of statistical studies, the most significant parameters, and come up with some statistical calculation, which if which you can see above this is positive is sepsis, but it's more specific because you're taking so many parameters into consideration. I mean, wonderful work done, so it can culminate in that.
Yeah, thank you.
If time permits, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, nice presentation, Dr. Suri. Actually, it's about COVID-19 and, the parameters which you have discussed. So I would like to know what is your experience about D-dimer, because many a times the patient recover from the disease and clinically they are fine. But it is the investigation D-dimer results which keep on bothering them, and it takes a lot of time in coming down. And to my experience, like what I have realized, there's a lot of variation from, place to place. Like a sample goes to one lab and then goes to another lab, and there is a lot of variation, and it also depends upon the instrument.
Right.
So would you like to comment on what could be the factors which are affecting, and the patient is more worried about D-dimer rather than, being about clinical symptoms?
So two things, D-dimer can of course be elevated for sometimes more than a month after the patient recovers. That is a known phenomenon. But more importantly, there is a large amount of variation in the D-dimer across labs, primarily for two reasons. The major challenge in India is actually a pre-analytic challenge, because that in coagulation you need to take the sample, separate the plasma within 2 hours, run it or freeze it. But the way this B2B industry runs, sample taken at 9 o'clock in the morning, reaches the main lab at 6:37 in the evening. By that time, the D-dimer values will automatically be elevated. I can give you anecdotal evidence of my own cousin, who in Gurgaon got from a B2B lab all their family got elevated D dimer. I asked them to go to Medanta next day, give the sample. Everybody's sample was normal. So this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is D dimer, unfortunately, is available across multiple technologies. Yeah. You can do a D dimer as an immunoturbidometry. Yes. You can do D dimer as an alpha. You can do D dimer through coagulation analyzer as well. Now all three technologies are totally different. So if I run the same D dimer sample across all three platforms, even within my own lab, I will get three different values. So without saying which is right, which is wrong, the point is, if your first D dimer value is on immunoturbidometry, then you pursue it on an immunoturbidometric platform, or vice versa. If you want to do on alpha, then continue doing it on the alpha platform.
Yes, it is the second point which actually we experienced, and we realized the methodology makes a lot of difference. Yes. If there is no pre-analytical issue.
No. So we ran D dimer samples of more than 20-30 patients across all three platforms, and the variation was something like between 200 to 300% across platforms. So it's like, one day you go for alpha, next day you go for immunoturbidometry, third day you go for coagulation, your D dimer will be all over the place.
Right, agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll end there. Thank you, Pradeep, for a very good talk. And I will invite Dr. Anuradha Sekaran, who's Director and Chief Pathologist, AIG Hospitals, Hyderabad, to give her talk on malignant cells identification in body fluids by the BC620.
So, as we all know, that detection of malignant cells in the body fluids is very important for the correct clinical treatment and diagnosis and for staging of cancers. And most of the time, the patient suddenly comes to us with only pleural or ascitic fluid. So, the cytology evaluation is very important, but as we are all aware, we require a very professional and expert cytopathologist to make a diagnosis. So, sometimes when you don't have a cytopathologist at site, they might be delay in sampling. So, this is where I thought that evaluation by the hematology analyzers can actually cut down this gap between the cytology and the hematology. And the screening by the hematology machines is a very rapid method and a good adjunct to the gold standard cytopathology. So most of these new 5-part and 7-part analyzers have also the new detection mode, that is the body fluid analyzer, where they are using the flow cytometry enabled, the high fluorescence body fluid mode, which is useful to discriminate between the malignant cells and the non-malignant cells. The scatter plot analysis of the instrument, actually it has 3 types, the forward scatter, side scatter and the light fluorescent. So the forward scatter usually works on the size of the cells. The side scatter, as you are aware, works on the nuclear details, and the light and the lateral fluorescence method helps to distinguish between these malignant and non-malignant cells. The most important part is the fluorescent intensity and the side scatter is higher for the tumor cells when compared to the mesothelial cells, because the tumor cells have more nucleic acid when compared to the mesothelial and the WBCs. So probably this is the main point on which the analyzers are able to separate the mesothelial and the tumor cells. Also, these cells, tumor cells tend to aggregate more and they have high fluorescence and side scatter. So this is what I wanted to say, that the side scatter is based on the nuclear details, the forward scatter is based on the size, and the fluorescent lateral fluorescence. These are the 3 components which are being used. So this is a study which we just did in 1 month, that is June 2022 at Asian Institute of Gastroenterology's main branch AIG hospitals at Hyderabad. The body fluids were received to the lab in K2 EDTA tubes as well as in sterile containers. We strongly recommend our clinicians to send whatever fluid they have aspirated, whether it is 10 ml or 1 liter. So we get ranges from 10 ml to almost 1 to 1.5 liter. An automated analysis and the slide preparation were done within 2 hours of receival of the lab. During this 1 month period, we have analyzed 147 serous fluids, which comprised of ascitic and pleural fluids on the Mindray BC 6200 body fluid mode. And all the samples were also microscopically screened on the cytospin slides with HND, MGG and PAP. And the malignant cells on cytospin slides were defined as those which were greater or equal to category 3 according to the IAC guidelines. So this was a small study which we did only in the month of June, where I considered only 147 fluids, and we had 4 fluids which were positive on the analyzer. So I would just like to go into details of those 4 cases. The case 1 is a 75-year-old female who had presented with signs of breathlessness and loss of weight and had a left massive pleural effusion. Around 400 ml of blood-tinged hazy pleural fluid was received for analysis. So if you see in the analyzer, as we have already discussed, we are going to analyze the total nucleated cells, the WBC cells, and the high fluorescence body fluid body fluid component, which showed around 62 cells. And in the manual microscopy, few atypical cells interspersed with reactive mesothelial cell clusters was noted. Cytology was moderately cellular, and it was categorized as category 3 atypical cells. So if you see this analyzer, here you have an area where there's a mixture of your high fluorescent cells and the mononuclear polymorphonuclear cells. So when you mask all these cells, so these are the 62% of the cells which are falling in that bracket. So so this was a cytosmear which showed a very cellular smear, and we had lot of reactive and mesothelial cells and some atypical cells. So probably sometimes on our cytosmears we are not very definitive to categorize it as malignant. So usually we take a cell block as a golden standard, and again here a good cell block evaluation and a good cytosmears will depend on how much of fluid and how good we mix it and how good we process it, particularly when you receive more than 100 ml. So usually in our institute we make it as a standard to at least for every 50 ml to try to make 1 cell block. So sometimes if you get 1 liter, we end up making as many as 8 to 10 cell blocks to improve the yield. So this was a fairly cellular cell block, and you can see that there is a acinar pattern of arrangement, and as we had already talked about the nuclear features, you have high NC ratio, clumped chromatin. This will go in favor of a malignant effusion. So this was positive for atypical cells, and even the instrument had picked up these atypical cells. The second case is a 37-year-old male who on triphasic CT was cirrhotic. There was splenomegaly, mild to moderate ascites. AFP was normal, and we received only 30 ml of yellowish hazy ascitic fluid. So if you see here again, you have this is your area where you have the clustering of the cells, but when you try to see, we had almost as few as only 3 cells. So we had taken a cutoff of high fluorescent cells of around 22. But here even with 3 cells, we are able to find that they are atypical cells. On the manual microscopy, they were predominantly mesothelial cells. But on cytology, there were few atypical cells. But probably it was false positive on cytology because cell block proved that they were reactive mesothelial cells. So this is the cytospin showing the reactive mesothelial proliferation, and this the cell block which showed only mesothelial cells. Probably on cytospin, these were the cells which we thought initially as malignant, but the cell block and IHC proved it as benign. This is a third case of 42-year-old male who had SOB, fever, multiple liver abscess. And CT also showed hepatic abscess with right lung consolidation. His CA 19.9 was around 15 and CA was normal. We received 10 ml of yellowish hazy pleural fluid. So again here if you see the high fluorescence area showed around 29 cells. This is absolute count, and the percentage was around 6.7%. So probably this is a false positive indication. So that means it's a mixture of the reactive mesothelial cells here which are being highlighted in this high fluorescent area, mimicking the malignant cells, because in cytology and cell block there were no malignant cells. So this is the cytospin smear showing only mesothelial cells and the cell block showing only reactive. So all the cells which show up in the high fluorescent areas need not be your malignant cells, and I will explain that in the subsequent slides. And this is the last case, the fourth case, a 65-year-old male who had cough, smoker, and CT showed lung mass with bilateral pleural effusion. We received pleural fluid. So here we had a total count of 492 and a WBC body fluid analysis revealed 487, and in the high fluorescent areas it was very less, around 5 cells, but this was false negative because the cell block showed few atypical cells. So if you see, these are the cytospin smears, and here we had some atypical cells, but the machine did not pick up this in the high fluorescent area, and the cell block proved that this was cancer. So we did IHC, and it showed strong positivity for TTF and napsin A. EMA was diffuse positive. The calretinine was negative except for highlighting the mesothelial cells, and the proliferative index was around 20%. So it proves that it was a malignant effusion of lung primary. So the basic discussion is the automated analyzers try to pick up the malignant cells, but it also picks up the mesothelial cells, so both of them are shown in the high fluorescent area. Now if you take only the forward scatter, it will go on the size of the cell. But cancer cells, as you know, can have varied size and varied morphology, so sometimes they are picked up in the high fluorescent areas, but sometimes if the size is smaller, you can miss them in that high fluorescent areas. Also, the high fluorescent body fluid cells were not included in the WBC counts, and they are expressed as a ratio of the WBCs or either as an absolute cell count. And the total nucleated cell count is the sum of the number of WBCs and the high fluorescent body fluid cells. The neutrophils and eosinophils are counted as polymorphonuclear cells, and the lymphocytes and monocytes are counted as mononuclear cells, and the mesothelial cells, macrophages, and malignant cells together come in the high fluorescent body fluid areas. Malignant cells show high forward and side scatter as well as lateral fluorescence, and also they are present in the aggregates. Now mesothelial cells can also have large volumes, larger than the WBC, and it is difficult to distinguish the mesothelial tumor only based on the size. So a combination of high fluorescence and side scatter is very, very useful to distinguish the tumor cells from the mesothelial cells. Also, what are the reasons for false negative? As we had few false negative and false positive. So the reason for false negative could be because you have a very small number of malignant cells, or the cells could be lost during the transport or processing, or they are aggregated, and this is particularly when you have a very large volume of fluid and you are probably not sampling enough amount, or there is improper mixing of the slide of the sample when you're preparing slides. So these are the reasons for the false negative, and the reasons for false positive are the mesothelial cells are those cells which are continuously in transition. That means they in long-standing inflammation, in tumor dialysis, etc., there is a transition of mesothelial cells to epithelial mesenchymal cells. So they change their morphology. So they become fibroblast-like cells, and they form pseudopod-like projections. And so because of this, they have an increased ability for invasiveness. So they almost mimic the malignant cells. So that is why they are picked up in the areas of high fluorescence. So that is why, because they show high fluorescence and side scatter, they are reflected in those areas. And a point to note is, when you are evaluating the fluids, you see mesothelial cells in ranging from the normal mesothelial cells to reactive, and those which are in this transition. That is why relying only on the high fluorescence sometimes may not help in distinguishing between these two cells. In fact, the Mindray BC 6800 has another parameter to this, which they have the malignant cells, which are able to distinguish to a much more ability from these reactive mesothelial cells and the malignant cells, and they come as a separate thing, but of course I don't have that analyzer to do that study. So what I would want to conclude is, even though we are not able to totally distinguish the malignant and the reactive mesothelial cells, once your analyzer is showing you a high fluorescent area, it should give you an index of suspicion that either you're dealing with reactive cells or malignant cells. So this should give you an ability to perform cytospin smears, go for additional cell block evaluation, and probably you can inform your clinician much more in advance before you get your cytology reports that probably you're dealing with a malignant effusion. And clinically suspected malignancies, usually most of the cytologists, sometimes the clinicians only ask for cell block on a later stage. But when they ask the fluid for TC and DC, probably we might be in a better stage if we are able to utilize these finer points of the automated analyzers and we analyze the graph and then we see these high fluorescent areas. We should be alerted to alert the clinician that probably we are dealing with a malignant or rule out reactive mesothelial cells. So I would like to say that the body fluid automated analysis might complement the cytology and you can improve your detection system. But the points to consider are the proper and thorough mixing of fluid aliquots before beginning automation and before preparing your cytology analysis is very, very important, so that you properly disperse the sediment to prevent these false negative or false positive results. And these automated analyzers have also, as I already said, they have now a new parameter called the malignant cells, which might help in correlation with this high fluorescent component to give you much more accurate results. And so in future, probably the automated analyzers can be almost an equal adjunct to cell block. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? 1 minute, 1 minute. That mic is coming to you.
What is preferred anticoagulant we can use for sample collection?
Yeah, you can use K2 EDTA tubes, but when you have a large volume fluid of around 1 liter, so obviously you cannot transport in the anticoagulant. So the sooner you receive the sample to your lab from the time it is aspirated and process it, it is better.
So what we get usually requisition is cytology for malignant cell, fluid cytology for malignant cell, okay? In conclusion, should we write positive for malignant cell or positive for atypical cells?
So you have this IAC guidelines. So you have the reporting format from negative to suspicious for malignancy and then definitive for malignancy. So it depends on the morphology of the cells. So when you have less cells, but still they are atypical, but you don't have enough material to conclude it is positive, then you give it as suspicious for malignancy. So in our institute, we have made it a protocol that any amount of fluid more than 10 ml, we try to make a cell block, because we have found that cell block will help us to pick up the cancer rate much more and to definitely identify mesothelial cells, and we can go for IHC.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was a very informative talk. Thank you very much. Now it's my great pleasure and privilege to call Dr. Pankhi Datta, who is a DM in hematopathology. In fact, she was, I think, one of the first DMs in hematopathology. That is her claim to fame, from AIIMS, New Delhi. And she's presently a consultant hematopathologist at Dubai Hospital, Dubai Healthcare Authorities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Shanaz. It's such a pleasure. I'm so thrilled and honored to be a part of this on-site meeting. Very thankful to Dr. Anil Handu and to Shama and the whole Mindray team for this. And I'll go to my topic. This is my old hospital, and this is where I work presently. This is the main referral center for hematology and oncology in Dubai. I work for the government. So I'm going to talk about, what we all say, atypical lymphoid cells in the peripheral blood. How do I move this? I don't know. Oh, sorry, it's the other one. Yeah, got it. So, yeah, this is the one, right? This is the pointer. This is the. Okay, and I think we all know about atypical lymphoid cells. The term came way back with the publication in 1923 when Downey and McKinley described what we know today are the activated T lymphocytes seen with infectious mononucleosis. This is a publication from 1935. Imagine there wasn't such good photography, but look at the illustration. And they have even differentiated how they are different from the blasts. So over time, oh God, I'm missing. So over time, we've come to know again that because of many immunologic stimuli, often infections and other conditions, you can have lymphocytes which get activated, become larger. The DNA synthesis is increased, because of which the cytoplasm also becomes more basophilic. Depending on the state of activation, can be very basophilic to pale gray, and they are larger. So they look different from what we normally see. So the term atypical was used. But, and we are very familiar, various viral infections, now with COVID-19. So we see all these cells, and we call them atypical, reactive. There are a whole lot of confusing terms. And usually when we see these blue cells and, patient has fever, even a little bit of low platelet counts, we don't worry too much. We know this is infection, viral infection, self-limited. Sometimes, of course, there can be, and usually the eye will pick up what is more obvious. These beautiful blue cells, we feel safe with them. But I would like to show you, and I have had experience with a couple of cases when both may exist together, something more sinister lying within. As this 32 months old baby girl who had actually a viral infection, and you can see what we call the virusites, the blue cells. But somehow clinically she seems sick. Finally, I think the buck stops with how the clinician feels. And then when we look closely, there were some which looked more sinister. I hope it's clear from there. The chromatin pattern is much open. This is another such cell. Here you can see one reactive cell and one blast-like cell. And because of this, we went ahead with the marrow, and the marrow was full of blasts. And after that, we actually have had one case here with dengue and BALL, and flow proved that this was BALL. So this was just to highlight that when we say typical cells, could be reactive cells along with some neoplastic cells and something like BALL. And usually when we talk about the basophilic cytoplasm, sometimes even reactive cells, if you look at the descriptions or review articles, activated lymphocytes, you can have cytoplasmic vacuolation. But remember, when we see a cell like this, even a single cell, one or two cells, in this case there was leukoerythroblastosis, we will think about a Burkitt's cell or Burkitt's lymphoma. Earlier it was called the L3 type of blast, L3 morphology, but today we know that this is a high-grade lymphoma, which looks like a blast, so it's a blastoid cell, and you have a hyperbasophilic, very blue cytoplasm with vacuolizations. And if sometimes, because this is a very highly proliferative tumor, so even in peripheral blood, you may have apoptotic cells, dying cells. And this was a marrow, which was a bit dilute, but of course, this is a mature cell. So there's a mature B cell marker. You should have surface immunoglobulins and absence of immature markers. And classically, you have CD10 is positive, just like a BALL. So it's important to show that usually TDT and CD34 are negative, and there is presence of surface immunoglobulin. Confirmation is always by flow, and here we have a classical cytogenetic marker as well. And this is something we are all familiar with. CLL cells, we say they are small cells, but in reality, they are small as compared to other neoplastic cells. So from reactive cells, we are moving on to neoplastic cells, where again the lymphoid, we can have variety of appearances. And I want to show you that even in today's day of flow cytometry, morphology does help, at least to decide maybe on the panel and how quickly we should do the flow. And so this is a classical CLL cell, small cells, but slightly larger than normal lymphocytes, small lymphocytes. And the chromatin is even more clumpier or coarse than a normal lymphocyte. And these are the smudge cells. And similarly, we have some small cells in a 55-year-old male who was actually admitted for investigation of pyrexia of unknown origin. All the cultures were negative. The peripheral smear review was done only because there was slight leukocytosis, and the slide review criteria in the lab were fulfilled. So the peripheral smear was seen. And there was nothing dramatic, just a leukocytosis with fever of 20,000, slight lymphocytosis. You can see there are normal platelets and a near normal hemoglobin. And these cells are small, but they're definitely different from what we just saw. These cells appear, there's hardly any cytoplasm. They look even smaller. A little bit of notching, tendency for cleaving, so that prompted by us, the clinicians looked for lymph nodes, which were finally a lymph node biopsy, and flow confirmed, or we suggested a diagnosis of follicular lymphoma, which is again a mature B-cell neoplasm. So they are all CD19 positive with kappa expression without lambda, and low-grade follicular lymphomas will typically have CD10 expression. So the morphology is quite characteristic, though they are also small cells. But flow confirmation is a must. Sometimes we know that this is a very classic morphology of a prolymphocyte. It's said that it's about twice the size of a small lymphocyte with a chromatin pattern that is intermediate, in between, like a blast would be completely open, while the others will be very coarse. So it's in between. And you have a very prominent central nucleolus. So, and usually the counts are very high. Splenomegaly is characteristic. And the flow will only show you a B-cell mature immunophenotype. It's not very characteristic. CD5 may be sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It's not, earlier it was thought it's related to CLL. It's a different entity altogether. So this was a B-PLL, prolymphocytic leukemia. And so prolymphocytic leukemia can arise from T cells also. There's a slight difference in the morphology. Compared to the other cells, they are more lobulated, there's cytoplasmic blebbing. The nucleoli are not as prominent as they were there. Count, in this case, the count was, I think, around 200,000. And again, flow. But the morphology itself, we thought it's something different. And the flow showed that we suggested, of course, a diagnosis of a T-PLL. So morphologically, they are quite distinct. You can see these are very classical, and these are a little different, and they turned out to be T-PLL. Then this was another interesting case, a 60-year-old male who came with some lytic lesions all over his skeleton. So the oncologist already said this is a case of multiple myeloma. But in the peripheral blood, you can see platelets are nearly, hemoglobin is nearly normal, platelets are slightly low, and absolutely normal differential. Neutrophils are normal. You can see 3 neutrophils here. But there were these occasional large cells, which look like a blast, actually. Large cells, high NC ratio, dispersed chromatin pattern. A technician brought it to me. I wanted to ignore one cell, leave it. No, there were about 11% cells. And the clinical diagnosis was multiple myeloma. But from the morphology, you have adequate neutrophils. So if it was a myeloid blast, very unlikely. If the marrow is so involved, you won't have near normal platelets. Unlikely. If it was plasma cells, you would expect with so many lytic lesions that some protein, some background staining should be there. So we thought, and we just commented, and it was later the biopsy came to be all DLBCL. So sometimes DLBCL, and I have had the experience of DLBCL with peripheral blood involvement with a count of 65,000, which was like unbelievable. And so this was DLBCL. So if it was really a very disseminated myeloma, you'd expect a dirty background, poor staining. That's why the photograph is also bad. And this also can look like an atypical lymphoid cell. And so when we are talking about pro-lymphocytes and we are talking about these big cells, this is a classical hairy cell. So it's also larger than the lymphocyte, with a chromatin pattern that is intermediate, again, in between a blast, easiest to understand it like that. Indistinct nucleolus, we may get these kind of hairy-like projections, fine projections all around. If you get them, very nice. But again, the difference from, say, we will not confuse with something else, because usually there's pancytopenia, monocytopenia, splenomegaly is expected. Other DDs are atypical hairy cell, SLVL. So sometimes just a peripheral smear can give us a diagnosis. This was a 40-year-old female who actually had hemolytic anemia. First came for hemolytic anemia with a big spleen, which was just some hemolytic anemia cannot explain, but there were no lymph nodes. Somehow the peripheral smear had not been looked at properly, and we saw some atypical cells with a tendency for some cytoplasmic projection, though they seem all over, but with a tendency to be on one side, polarized, and with a big spleen without finding anything else. LDH was high. The patient was started on rituximab and did much better. Hemoglobin improved. Spleen was, definitive diagnosis would have been splenectomy, but the marrow on HNE, you really cannot, they're very subtle infiltrates which are picked up, interstitially involved B cells. That's the only information we could give. So this was really a rare case. This was a small child who came with monocytosis. So usually if it's not a hematologic center, without a trained hematologist, so many monocytosis, we think of infection or they're missed. So it came to us. So I was very excited that I said, this is likely to be, JMML, because monocyte count was very high. And they were all, these cells were counted as monocytes. So I said, this is JMML, do all the molecular tests. And even the clinician was very happy with the answer. There was hepatosplenomegaly, child was very sick, and there were some lymph nodes, which can happen with JMML. And we see quite a few cases of JMML. So, but the parents and JMML really flow doesn't play a big role. But just make sure there are no blasts, just do it. Sometimes the parents want, so a flow was done. And I was just thinking that they're all monocytes. But all these big cells, which are actually falling in the mono gate, they are negative for monocytic markers. Instead, they were positive for T cell markers. And by the time patient left, and I really couldn't understand that there's this aberrant population that needs to be looked at, one of those vague reports that you feel very ashamed of later on. I'm sure all of us do it at some point of time. But luckily, somebody had done a lymph node biopsy. Patient went away, and this child had an ALK lymphoma. So an ALK lymphoma circulating in peripheral blood is really rare and very bad prognosis. Child came back to actually India. But this was a lesson learned that, anything, then I went back, studied, took many photographs. And if you go back, some of them, there are some smaller cells also. I'm sure these are also the neoplastic cells. And there was few monocytes. But in my count, in the differential count, I counted almost about 19% monocytes. But here, when I went back, it was much less. And I really couldn't explain, kept analyzing, took help. And so this was a, let's say, bummer, absolutely. Just wanted to share with all of you. So when I have shown that, and people have with COVID-19, we can see activated lymphocytes. So there are lots of papers, and you all have done enormous work on COVID-19. I haven't done much, but people have also looked at presence of reactive lymphocytes. These patients seem to do better. And so there are papers, and if you can somehow make it more objective using any of these artificial intelligence systems, it seems to even help in prognosticating. But so when we can have such a gamut of cases, where you have atypical lymphoid cells, so it's really not correct to use the term atypical lymphoid cells and leave it. So what are the guidelines? So if we follow the European guidelines that came out some time ago, So I said, even on morphology itself, based on just morphology, if you are relatively sure that this looks like reactive, mention reactive. Reactive means it's benign, or abnormal lymphocyte, or atypical lymphocyte. Suspect, neoplastic. Suspect, nobody can put you in jail later on, even if it's not. And if uncertain, it's good to put down that also. And the ICH is the International Committee for Standardization in Hematology. They also suggest certain things that, and so I would like to conclude that, we have seen that lymphocyte with any morphological aberration, even if it's reactive, would be often labeled as an atypical lymph, and the buck really doesn't stop there. And there's a whole lot of terminology, and including monocytoid lymphocytes, because they look like monocytes. And, but one should attempt to use terminology which would be of some use to the clinician. So, and according to the ICSH, reactive lymphocyte usually means benign, while an abnormal lymphocyte means neoplastic. Some say that reactive lymphocyte means benign, while a lymphoid cell means probably neoplastic. And the ICHS also recognizes, though they have laid some guidelines, that country to country, region to region, people may be more familiar with some terms and not so familiar with others. And whatever atypical lymphocytes you see, if it's 1 or 2%, it's good to mention on the peripheral blood film. If they're of significant number, they should be included in the differential count. But unless flow or something is proven what they are, you should just not, put your opinion there, unless it's as distinctive as a pro-lymphocyte or even hairy cell. You just say atypical cells, still flow proves. But if it is strangely, of course, if it's a blast, you're sure it's a blast. That should be in the differential count. And as I have said that artificial intelligence guided objective morphology may be useful, as people are already finding. There are experiences, there are papers. And I would like to end with this case, which was published in 2020 in the Lancet. So old is really gold, I would like to say, because this particular case is a classical case of infectious mononucleosis. So in 1935, we had those illustrations with such beautiful pictures. Downey and McKinley had, described 3 types of cells, type 1, type 2, type 3. And I want to just show you this type 2 cells. They seem to hug the surrounding cells. So once you see this phenomena, you are a little more confident that these are reactive cells, giving it a scalloped appearance, so type 1, type 2, type 3. So this Lancet paper describes these cells, and this picture is from the Lancet. And they did IgM for Epstein-Barr virus. It was negative. All the markers were negative. Then they went back to the peripheral smear. There are some criteria that 80% cells should be, atypical appearing. And they made a diagnosis based on this, and it was proven by PCR. So perhaps morphology still plays a role. We can, of course, make it more objective. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pankaj. That was really very interesting, and also cleared some of the doubts, but this has always been a very gray area of what you call atypical, or what you call abnormal, or what you call reactive, so, or activated lymphocytes, so many different terminologies. So perhaps digital imaging may help in this one area, I feel, to standardize the nomenclature of the kinds of lymphocytes we see. But that is, I think, a huge exercise for the future. So any questions on this?
Yeah, hi.
Beautiful presentation, Dr. Pankhi. I really liked it because, this is something we keep on facing on day-to-day basis.
True.
So, while working in a tertiary care center, we come across cases where people are just writing sometimes atypical, sometimes abnormal, sometimes reactive, transformed. So there are multiple terms which have been used for these so-called suspicious-looking cells. And when they come to us, I think very important point, you have already highlighted the multiple points, important points, which one has to keep in mind. One is like one should start from the history, I'll say.
True.
So that is something we cannot ignore because that gives us light, but despite a history, we have to use all our senses, in terms of getting ahead, and we cannot just stop calling them atypical. Like recently, just maybe 3-4 days back, we came across a case where somebody labeled us as atypical lymphoid cell, then somebody called them even erythroid leukemia. And when this young guy came to us, the peripheral blood, to our surprise, was full of such kind of so-called atypical looking cells, which we ourselves were not sure, which category it is. And then we just kept on investigating. Of course, we landed in a flow, and it was a plasma cell leukemia.
Young
Never
boy.
expected.
Oh,
that
that's
it's
a bummer,
plasma
like
cell.
this case,
Yeah.
okay.
So this was like an...
How old was the patient?
Patient was not too old, maybe in 40s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What is
So
that?
I think what people are using the term, maybe atypical word is something very non-specific when we don't know, but transformed, reactive, definitely point towards a reactive cause or a benign cause.
And
rather
I
than
personally feel, I'm nobody, there are guidelines, but when we
Yes,
say atypical, it means something sinister, you know.
right.
While atypical was actually, it came from the infectious mononucleosis, the downy cells. So that term has stayed, so it's very vague. It's also a leeway when you're not sure, just write atypical and get
No,
away.
we really like the
But
cases you shared with us.
thank you so much, so kind of you.
I also have a question here.
Hi.
We come from the same state, Assam.
Yes.
No? Same college. So what happens is that in our slides, we do get activated lymphocytes. We don't write atypical. But I take home a message that we can give a certain guideline. If we are not, suppose we do not have flow, we can give reactive, like atypical, not atypical. We write activated lymphocyte. Could we write reactive?
As long as you, yeah, Mamta.
This conundrum is really this thing.
You can look at these guidelines also.
Yeah,
It's
but
there freely,
RCPA,
2015.
thankfully,
Yeah.
RCPA this year, they have come up with the term which is known as abnormal lymphocytes. So anything which we were writing atypical, activated, reactive, query, all that, now it all goes into abnormal lymphocytes. So since now there is a guideline for RCPA, we have started using the term abnormal lymphocytes for these kind of cells.
Yeah, but just saying abnormal, like, whether it is, what do you think? Is it reactive? Because abnormal, is it a lymphoma cell? If you're reasonably confident, it's good to put down that.
Exactly.
That's all, that's the whole thing from my talk. And secondly, I really wanted to highlight this, the virusites with blasts. I have got quite a few cases, maybe 3, 4. So sometimes when you see these, you will say that, oh, it's a viral infection, but it has happened, and so you have to be careful about that also. I think that's all.
And another thing on this morphology, when we were talking about COVID-19.
Yeah, you
so
have a lot of
as Dr.
experience.
Suri already pointed out, the NLR is more because of the apoptosis of the lymphocytes, and not only apoptosis, various mechanisms, because of which the patient undergoes into a lymphocytopenia, and that's how the NLR increases. So to our surprise, because we have always been thinking that viral infections, so there will
Should
be
have
more
more,
morphology
yeah.
on lymphocytes, like abnormal, atypical, reactive, activated, all that. But we again conducted a study, and to our surprise, we found that there was a lot of morphological changes actually in the neutrophils. So there we had these acquired angulated neutrophils, acquired Pelger-Hewitt, of course apoptosis, toxic granulation. So reactive lymphocyte actually came 5th or 6th in our list of the enumerated morphology.
Actually, this paper just said that if they're present and they're a little different from the other cells, I'm also not that convinced, but if they're present, these patients seem to do better because probably the immune response mounted is better. That's what, I mean, it might just stimulate somebody to do more work. Yeah.
Nice talk, Dr. Punky.
Thank you.
It is a morphological kind of a treat.
Thank you. I think pathologists like anything to do with morphology.
At this
There is someone,
point, I
sir.
would like to, at this point, I would just like to say that I am from a tertiary care hospital, JSS hospital from Mysore. So there, earlier, I think probably around till 10 years back, we were reporting some of the cases as atypical lymphocytes, and many of the cases were referred to us for bone marrow evaluation because the clinicians thought these could be malignant cells.
Exactly.
So we are forced not to use the term as atypical lymphocytes, and now uniformly for all reactive lymphocytes we are reporting them as reactive lymphocytes and not atypical lymphocytes. Once we mention atypical, they understand it is malignant and they send the cases for marrow.
True.
Thank you.
Yes, I think even when we are reporting, we get a little worried about what to write so that you don't alarm the clinician unnecessarily. If they are virocytes, then you don't like to call them abnormal or atypical, then you would probably call them transformed or reactive. So we come up with our own way of
and your clinicians understand what you mean.
But actually it should be more standardized. I feel the reporting should be more standardized.
Yes, could I just make one comment?
Yes, please, of course.
Just 10 days back, we had the publication in Leukemia Lymphoma and the new WHO classification.
Yeah.
There is nothing like pro-lymphocytic leukemia anymore. No PLL.
I missed that. I went through the AML. Yeah, okay. Thank you for pointing that out.
There is nothing like...
So what do this PLL, what are they called?
It's called splenic lymphoma with prominent nucleoli of B cell type.
Yeah, there's a major change in the terminology. I should have changed that.
There is nothing like variant hairy cell leukemia.
It's been removed,
just hairy cell leukemia. So a lot of changes has happened.
True, sir.
Please go through those two seminal publications, and the new blue book will be by the end of the year.
Will it really be at the end of the year or?
By end of the year, or maybe by the time we get it, it will be early January, February of 23.
True.
Yes, it is a publication in Leukemia.
It's free. It's freely available. Yeah.
It is the same WHO group that has published it.
And our Tata people are the authors, so it's great.
So, no, there is no TPLL also. Nothing like like we used to excel in saying that it is CLL, PLL when we had 11 to 55% of.
So morphology, in fact, is given even more stress with a prominent nucleolus. So if it is T, it will be T, it will be B, it will be B.
The classification, it's 70% genomics.
Right.
30% morphology. Like she said, that is ALK negative ALCL. Until unless you demonstrate 2,5 translocation, it is not ALCL.
I couldn't explain those cells, why they look like monocytes.
So that was a leukemic phase of ALCL.
Yeah, which is very rare.
So if you cannot demonstrate 2,5, it's not LCL. So 2,5 translocation has to be demonstrated on the peripheral blood.
Once 2,5 we found, then I could explain all the T cell markers and those large cells.
So everybody must go through those two publications. The entire classification has changed.
So thank you.
So that as per the talk with the TMH people, this soft copy will be probably available next month, and the hard copy of the new classification will come in the November.
Soft copy is already available.
No, in total soft copy. There will be modified change with the modified change available in the November. And in your case, there was the splenomegaly without lymphadenopathy. So when there is a splenomegaly without lymphadenopathy, only 4 causes are the common causes. So that I want to add. And one is that hairy cell leukemia, SLVL, LGL, and PLL. So these are my inputs. Thank you.
True.
Right. Thank you.
Ma'am, just one question. You said ki we should not mix, like activated lymphocyte can be seen with blasts. So do scatter plots help differentiating? Like have you seen activated lymphocyte showing high fluorescence lymphocyte and the merging of mono and lympho together?
Frankly speaking, I have no idea. I use a Coulter. I don't look at the plots.
But you do have the high fluorescent lymphocyte cells.
Anyway, it will be there. There will be anyway atypical. And we see those flags for atypical lymph, but it could be blast, it could be actually what we say atypical lymph.
Okay. Because when I see the PS, I look at the scatteroplasm.
I doubt it will really differentiate that these extra blasts are present. I don't know. I don't have the experience.
Okay. Thank you.
So it's, I think, right?
It's time.
So yeah, I think Shamma has It's time up now for these.
Because we have 4 more sessions.
Okay.
So,
right.
yeah.
So you better cut them short now.
Yes.
It's really time up. Okay. Thank
So
you,
thank
all
you,
speakers.
Dr. Punky, yeah. And thank you, Dr. Shanaz, for chairing the session. Thank you. It was a wonderful session. May I call upon stage Dr. Mishra for chairing the next 2 sessions.
Very good evening, everyone. Since we are already running late, I will not take much time in introducing the speaker. However, the speaker is Dr. Prabhu Meghanathan. He is the director of a laboratory called Hybrinomics in Bangalore. Many publications to his credit. So what he is going to speak is on the identification of abnormal cells with respect to flagging and new parameters of advanced hematology analysis. Dr. Prabhu, please.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Good evening, all. And yes, sir. Yes. You would have heard a lot of talk from morning, probably from afternoon, looking at more of abnormal cells, and abnormal cells. Let us look something normal for the day. When I'm a pathologist, I love abnormal, but I do love normal more than abnormal. So this is what we do in my place. What we do there. How do you move? Okay. What we do is basically we do kind of in silico study first. Try to find our area of interest, find molecules, find targets. And once we've designed a molecule and targets, and then we try to go ahead and predict our hypothetical data. So in this, we started this journey quite long back, I think 3 years back. We found a molecule which could target T and B lymphocytes, basically the B lymphocyte. So when we did our analysis, then we thought, can we differentiate T and B lymphocyte using a normal hematology analyzer? This was our first goal and hypothetical study. This was the previous study which we did, where we knocked out almost all the cells on an analyzer, where you could see that the graph down, which is the pointer. Okay. Here, this was the first when we did the molecule, where we knocked down almost all the cells, and the cells which we isolated when we ran on a hematology analyzer, we could just get directly B cells. But the drawback of this study, what we did was a lot of debris, which is to come up when you run a normal culture, which is to always be a hindrance to do analysis. So we went ahead, started with another study, where we wanted to think, can we reduce the lysine debris down? Or can we knock out the procedure protocol from our study, avoid lysine? Then quantify it. And also this time we looked at the morphological pattern of analysis of this. So this is a normal culture, any 5-part, or which has additional with the fluorescence staining pattern. So when you look at this pattern here, this is a normal, untreated sample. And you know the lymphocyte, monocyte, and neutrophils part of it. When we treat it with the molecule what we have, so we could see there's a cut down of our area of lymphocytes, and majority these things are getting degenerated and lost. We'll talk about this later. Please look at the corner part, the left lower part of the area where major chunk is lost. So when we analyze the same sample on flow, both on treated and untreated, we could see a drastic reduction of this B lymphocyte population, which is almost like dropping down from 2% to less than 0.5%. So this is what our analogy is, but when you look at the T population, it remains almost the same. So the molecule of interest, the first initial target where we looked at how we knocked out the entire population of lymphoids from peripheral blood, and we analyzed with a normal analyzer to count down the B cells. Now we came up with a strategy where we don't knock out or lyse anything else, but we try to retain the morphology and get back in the normal culture analysis. So that's why we moved on and produced a better scatter plot. And this also we could see here. This is probably some kind of infection condition who has probably, we looked at various parameters. But in this you could see more of scattered loss of degenerative population of lymphoid cells here. This is what, when we look at the same diagram in the flow, here we see the same thing, B, which was almost 8-9%, is knocked down to 0.3%. So it's called a selective selection of population and doing analysis of the same thing. So by this, we could categorize T and B cell using a normal hematology analyzer rather than using a flow of it. So that was the strategy behind it. So when we go ahead and look at the other data, what we generated for the number of samples we did, it was a small study. We look at the entire WBC count, including the T cells and lymphocyte percentage, almost very similar on the treated and non-treated samples. Where the same thing was compared with flow. When we look at the flow data, also looks the same thing when you look at the T and B. The most important strategy here, we could look at the B cells population, which is almost drastically dropped down, retaining the T cell population. So this was our target of goal, and we did achieve it. So the first two objectives, what we wanted to knock out is the amount of debris generated out in the first, the previous study, and knocking down more of the B cells out and populating the T cells into my study. So then when we looked at the morphology of both these cells, it's a little strange. When these are like untreated cells. When you look at the treated cells, lymphocytes still retain the same thing. Some of the cells do show some kind of changes in the cytoplasmic membrane pattern of it. So, but when you look at the other cells, which is like neutrophils or monocytes, most of the cells are smudged out. So this is the reason why we have those smudging in the scattergram of a normal culture where the monocytes and neutrophils show a lot of degeneration pattern. So this was not our final conclusion. So we wanted to think, could we not use any treatment of a cell or do not treat the cell? Can we use the same normal hematology analyzer to actually count the T and B lymphocyte? So based on this, look at the normal flow data. When we look at the normal flow data, we can just analyze the CD20 cells or the B cells. Usually have kind of low scatters, could be both forward scatter and the side scatter, but the fluorescence intensity also is low when you compare to that of a T cell. So keeping this analogy, we moved on and then try to re-look at the data of the treated and non-treated cells. As I said before, try to look at the lower left corner of a lymphoid population. This area is what we think it's possibly of B cell in any scattergram. So in looking at the data what we analyzed, we could say that probably the area of the treated and the non-treated cells, when you look at it in comparison, the area which is lost is this, which was also compared with that of the flow data. So therefore, we could further subtype by mathematically and shortlisting on the raw data. The B and T lymphocyte populations can be categorized using a normal hematology analyzer, that's a 5-part analyzer, which has a fluorescence dye. So this requires more data to look into it. So this is our data. So we don't, as Anil Handusar was saying, more digital pathology and stuff. We are also not only into the point where we do it. So the staining pattern where most of us kept on talking, we require digital and artificial intelligence, where we require slides. So we've moved ahead of a technology where we create called as a bubble trap, where we don't require a slide to stain a section. We successfully completed on a histopath section to do a staining of a section without a slide. So the digital morphology can be applied even to hematology, where we can stain a cell without a slide and digitize the cell on the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prabhu. Since we have paucity of time, we'll restrict it to one question. Anyone has anything to clarify and comment, question? So, if no one has any question, I have a simple one. So, what exactly is the aim and objective of this particular enterprise that you have?
Basically, we work on creating the new tools and new parameters.
You mean to say that by digital imaging you can differentiate a lymphocyte from T to B?
Not exactly digital imaging. We can categorize using the scatter plots, as well as we can subcategorize the low scatters and low fluorescence cells, and then divide it based on the SDs, and then we can see that they could be subcategorized as T and B using a normal hematology analysis.
Okay. Thank you. There are no more questions. So I invite the next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Rajesh Fatale. He is the head of Department of Pathology at the Sahyadri Hospital in Pune. I have a good friend of mine in that hospital, Sasi Apte. The topic that he is going to speak is study and evaluation of monocytosis on a Coulter platform. Rajesh.
Thank you very much, sir. And at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Anil Handu for inviting me to this forum and making my presentation in front of you. So I'll straight away go to my presentation, which is evaluation of monocytosis. This will be a particularly not only restricted to the cell counter data, but it will have some additional points as well. So I'll be going through initial data and then later on few cases. So as monocytosis has been defined as absolute monocyte count of more than 1,000 with a percent monocyte of more than 10%, and it should be persistent for more than 3 months. And these are the various causes that have been described for the monocytosis. It can be differentiated from reactive to clonal disorders, and it's a long list. But to particularly mention over here will be bone marrow recovery, then exercise-induced acute infections, some chronic infections, and apart from that, the clonal disorders. Now, before I go to my cases, here are two cell counter printouts, wherein the cell counter data, that is the CBC values, quite help you a lot when you compare the cell counter values with the scatter plots. So the patient presents with a hemoconcentration along with thrombocytopenia and a monocytosis, wherein the scatter is not differentiated very well from the lymphocyte scatter. And this is most commonly seen and interpreted as pseudomonocytosis, which is most commonly seen in viral fevers. And if you have some clone over in this area or in this area, then you can have a suspect flag of malarial parasite in such kind of scenarios as well. In malarial parasite, you can have a distinct clone, particularly the Vivax infections. So this pseudomonocytosis is quite common in viral fevers, which all of us are dealing with on day-to-day basis. Apart from that, we will have to keep in mind that this cell counter data also helps us to differentiate the monocytosis in some of the other conditions, wherein this is actually a bone marrow Coulter plot, wherein we aspirate the bone marrow samples for the cell counter. And herein, even in the bone marrow sample, usually we do get this WBC count in thousands, but here the count is quite low, and you see monocytosis over here, which is quite similar to the reactive lymphocyte or kind of a scatter plot. But this is quite often seen in patients of hairy cell leukemia. So you have to be quite sure while seeing the morphology, as Dr. Panki has also showed the morphological details of hairy cell, you need to be too sure, and it is very well mentioned that hairy cells can mimic or can have a area of monocytes in the cell counter scatter plots. So with this, I'll just go to the case presentations. This is a young male having a history of cough, fever, headache, breathlessness for last 2 months. He presents with weight loss, generalized weakness. There is evening rise of fever, productive cough. Hence, Cox etiology is suspected. X-ray X-ray chest shows bilateral pneumonitis. However, there is no lymphadenopathy or there is no hepatosplenomegaly. His CBC picture shows mild anemia, mild leukocytosis with monocytosis, and the platelet counts are slightly low. RDW is quite high. The monocytes are large convoluted nuclei and having a moderate cytoplasm. His LFT, RFT is normal. Thinking of infective etiology, most of his workup has been done for the infective markers, which have come negative. Even the ANA workup has been done, which is also negative. And then the sample comes to us for running a flow cytometry for the evaluation of these monocytes. Now, this is the Coulter plot. It shows a monocytosis which is quite distinct from the reactive lymphocyte kind of a scatter plot. And hence this is the morphology. These are quite atypical looking monocyte with nuclear convolutions. The moderate cytoplasm is there. The other cell lines look almost normal. So we have run this flow cytometry wherein the precursor markers are negative. 34 and 117 is negative. The monocytes do show moderate to bright side scatter with moderate CD45 expression. And the routine markers like the 33, 64 and 11B are quite positive. Along with that, CD4, 14 also is positive. And CD4, 14 versus 16 expression shows predominantly CD14 positive with a small clone of CD16 positive. So usually on 14, 16 scatter plots, there are three types of monocytes which have been described. The classical or the typical monocytes, which will be CD14 positive, 16 negative. Intermediate will be CD14 and 16 both positive. And atypical will be CD16 positive and CD14 dim. This shows majoritarily the CD14 positive cells, which are CD16 negative, and with slight population showing CD14, 16 positivity. So in nutshell, he is a young male with febrile illness, loss of weight, X-ray finding is suggestive of pneumonia. There is no organomegaly, no lymphadenopathy, anemia, thrombocytopenia with monocytosis. So one will think of an inflammatory etiology. So inflammatory pathology was suspected, but there was significant macrocytosis, which was not explained under any conditions. The MCV was ranging around 108 femtoliters. So close follow-up was suggested for this young guy. Bone marrow was done, which was done outside, not with us. It was hypercellular. All three cell lines were well preserved. There were no abnormal cell collections. Upon follow-up up to 21 days, his hemoglobin is still dropped. WBC count, even though has come down, but the monocytes are almost the same. The absolute monocyte count remains around 6,000. And there are 2% blasts with hypolobated neutrophils. So monocytes remain the same, and there are hypolobated neutrophils, and some other fields showed 2% blast. So here the suspicion of myelodysplastic syndrome, CMML kind of a morphology was suspected, even though the patient was quite young. His EPO was done, which was more than 758. LDH was slightly raised, and just to rule out the infective pathology, blood culture was reported, it was negative. Hence, his sample was sent to Medgenome for DNA analysis, which showed KRAS mutation and FANK-A gene positivity. So this young male had some abnormalities wherein Fanconi's anemia can be suspected, and this CMML can be a part of myelodysplastic syndrome. The second case is an elderly lady with, who is a known case of hypertension with Parkinson's disease, who is on treatment, and she is presented with persistent leukopenia around 1,000 for almost more than 3 months. Now she presents with low hemoglobin, no lymphadenopathy, no organomegaly. ANA workup is positive, DCT is positive. Hemoglobin is 9.2, WBC is 1,000, platelets are 77,000. With a significant monocytosis of 33%. But if you see the absolute monocyte count, it won't go too much high. Right, so this is the scatter plot. there is monocytosis, but this monocytosis looks quite different from the one which with the young male. This is a distinct monocyte clone which is distinct from the neutrophilic clone. And these are the pictures. So these monocytes with cytoplasmic vacuolations are quite commonly seen. All the monocytes were showing cytoplasmic vacuolations, and apart from that there was no other significant morphological changes. This also came to us for evaluation on flow cytometry. The flow cytometry didn't show any precursor markers. 3311B and CD4 was positive. This showed, the 1416 plot showed that there is significant population of 14 positive, 16 negative, along with that significant population in 14 positive, 16 positive, and there was a population of 14 negative, 16 positive as well. All three populations were there. So these were the positive markers and the negative markers. So elderly female with persistent cytopenia with autoimmune positivity. So autoimmune etiology of cytopenia was suspected, and a reactive monocytosis was indicated. Now just to go ahead, we have these documents, or we have these publications with us. How I investigate monocytosis is a very nice document, wherein the morphological details of monocytes, monoblasts and promonocytes have been very well defined. And majority of these the samples which or the monocytes which I showed were showing atypical monocyte kind of a morphology. However, in clinical practice, the document also mentions that it is quite difficult to apply morphological criteria when distinguishing reactive versus dysplastic monocytes from promonocytes or monoblast. There can be an inter-observer, a very high inter-observer variation. This is mentioned in the document itself. Those monocytes, as I mentioned, shows the routine. Even the HLA-DR can be shown by mature monocytes or the normal monocytes. So HLA-DR doesn't indicate the immaturity of this. Apart from that, these three types which I already mentioned to you. Despite the wealth of immunophenotypic data provided by flow cytometry, it must be kept in mind that abnormal immunophenotype itself is not specific for malignancy. That's what we saw just now. And in reactive monocytosis, it can itself is a non-specific thing, and there can be changes, reactive changes, which may mimic a neoplastic etiology as well. So, initial steps for the monocytosis. This is one more document or the publication which has come up in 2021, wherein the algorithm for monocytosis have been defined. So confirm the morphology. So here, in spite of the cell counter data, they mentioned it as you have to confirm the morphology on the peripheral blood smear, and we have seen the morphological alterations. If no dysplasia and isolated monocytosis is there, repeat after 3 months. If the monocytosis is resolved, likely to be transient reactive cause. If the monocytosis is persistent, the monocyte compartment flow, absence of reactive or classical monocyte fraction of more than 94%, suspect CMML. So here they have categorized classical CD14-16 group of more than 94% as a possible CMML kind of a morphology. And expansion of the CD16 positive monocyte is more likely to be a reactive monocytosis. So they have shown this. This is a normal monocyte population on flow cytometry with CD14-16. Second one is a reactive, wherein all the three are there, and this is the CMML kind of a thing, wherein the CD14 positive and 16 negative is the majority population. So with this, when I showed you the first case, even though he being a young male, the majority population was in the CD14 positive, 16 negative area, as compared to this elderly lady, wherein all the three populations were there, suggesting a reactive etiology. So with this monocytosis, you cannot suspect a definitive etiology if the peripheral smear findings are not supporting or there are no conclusive other peripheral smear supportive findings. Okay, with that I'll thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. That's a nice talk, because monocytosis in clinical practice is sometimes very difficult to.
Yeah, it's really difficult many times how to classify these cells.
So in the second case, you didn't feel like putting it as CMML?
Looking at the flow cytometry, no, and this is
71-year-old with cytopenia,
so
with monocytosis.
Right, sir. Now, elderly female with persistent cytopenia. Actually, this is the recent case. On this, we received on 19th of July, and it has also been received from outside. They are doing the bone marrow. I don't know the finding of the bone marrow, but just to show the difference between the plots of CD14-16 in a demonstrated case of MDS versus most probably a reactive kind of a monocytosis. But yes, bone marrow and further testing is indicated even in this case, even though she has ANA positivity.
And cytogenetics is also important.
Of course, yes.
Because if you have a monosomal karyotype like chromosome 7 abnormality,
definitely
you could say that it could be
CMML or MDS kind of a thing.
Any question from the audience? Yes? Okay, I think the audience is fatigued.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh Fatale, and thank you, Dr. Mishra, for such a academic feast, and thank you for chairing.